Jerusalem was burning. Flames climbed through the cedar beams of the temple Solomon had built. Babylonian soldiers moved through streets once filled with worshippers, merchants, priests, royal officials, and children. The walls that had protected the city for generations were broken. Sacred vessels were carried away. Houses were reduced to ash. Beyond the ruined gates, captives were gathered for the long journey east, and the throne of David stood empty. For centuries, kings had ruled from this city. Some had defended the covenant, others had corrupted it. Some had torn down pagan altars, others had built them within sight of the temple. They had inherited armies, palaces, treasuries, alliances, and promises. Yet now the kingdom was gone, the temple was destroyed, and the people were being taken into exile. How had it come to this? How did a nation that once celebrated the victories of David and the wisdom of Solomon fracture into two rival kingdoms? Why did Israel fall to Assyria? Why did Judah survive for more than a century longer, only to suffer the same fate under Babylon? And how could a royal line promised a lasting future end with a defeated king being led away in chains? To understand the fall of Israel and Judah's kings, we must return to a time before Jerusalem was the capital, before Israel possessed a royal palace, and before any man wore a crown over the 12 tribes. The story begins when Israel had no king. After the death of Joshua, the tribes of Israel lived throughout the land of Canaan without a permanent central government. They were united by ancestry, covenant worship, and law, but they often acted as separate tribal communities. When enemies attacked, God raised judges, leaders such as Deborah, Gideon, and Samson to deliver the people. But the period of the judges was marked by a repeated and destructive cycle. Israel turned away from the Lord, oppression followed, the people cried out, a deliverer arose, peace returned. Then, when the danger passed, the nation drifted again. The book of Judges describes an age in which everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That phrase does not mean Israel lacked divine instruction. The law had already been given through Moses. The problem was that the people repeatedly rejected it. They possessed a covenant, but they did not consistently live as a covenant people. By the end of the period, Israel's weakness was impossible to ignore. Tribal rivalries had nearly produced civil war. Foreign enemies threatened the land. Religious leadership had been corrupted. The people needed faithful direction, but neither military strength nor inherited tradition seemed able to hold the nation together. Into this unstable world came Samuel. His birth had been an answer to the prayers of his mother Hannah. While still young, Samuel served at the sanctuary under Eli the priest. Eli's sons abused their position, treated offerings with contempt, and brought disgrace upon the priesthood. Their corruption became a sign of a larger crisis. The institutions meant to guide Israel were themselves failing. During these years, the Philistines became one of Israel's greatest threats. They occupied key territories, controlled important military resources, and repeatedly challenged the tribes from the coastal plain. In one disastrous battle, Israel treated the Ark of the Covenant as if it were a weapon that could guarantee victory regardless of the nation's spiritual condition. The Ark was brought into the camp, but Israel was defeated. Eli's sons were killed, and the Ark was captured. The loss was devastating. Yet the Philistines soon discovered that possessing the Ark did not mean possessing Israel's God. After suffering calamity in their cities, they returned it. The Ark came back, but the deeper lesson remained. Israel could not manipulate the presence of God while ignoring the commands of God. Samuel eventually emerged as prophet, judge, and national leader. He called the people away from foreign gods and back to the Lord. Under his leadership, Israel experienced deliverance from the Philistines, and Samuel traveled through the land administering justice. For a time, the nation possessed what it needed most, a leader who listened to God and guided the people faithfully. But Samuel grew old. His sons, Joel and Abijah, were appointed as judges in Beersheba. They did not follow their father's example. They pursued dishonest gain, accepted bribes, and twisted justice. Once again, Israel saw leadership becoming corrupted from within. The elders of the tribes gathered and went to Samuel at Ramah. They presented a concern that was not entirely unreasonable. Samuel was old. His sons were unfit to succeed him. The nation remained vulnerable to powerful neighbors. Israel needed stability beyond the lifetime of one faithful judge. But their proposed solution revealed something deeper. "Give us a king to judge us," they demanded, like all the other nations. Israel was not the first society to be ruled by kings. Across the ancient Near East, monarchy was the normal form of government. Kings commanded armies, collected taxes, built cities, negotiated alliances, and established dynasties. A throne provided visible continuity. When one king died, his son could inherit the crown. To Israel's elders, kingship appeared practical. A king could unite the tribes. A king could organize an army. A king could lead them against their enemies. A king could provide the political structure they believed they lacked. The law of Moses had already anticipated the possibility that Israel would one day have a king. Deuteronomy described limits for that ruler. He was not to multiply horses, wives, or wealth for himself. He was to live under God's law rather than above it. The problem then was not simply that Israel requested a king. The problem was the kind of king they desired, and the reason they desired him. They wanted to be like the surrounding nations. They wanted a visible ruler who would go out before them and fight their battles. They were searching for security in political structure and military power. Their request suggested that the rule of God was not enough unless it looked like the systems around them. Samuel was displeased. But when he prayed, the Lord told him to listen to the people. They had not merely rejected Samuel, they had rejected God as their king, repeating the same pattern that had marked their history since the Exodus from Egypt. Still, they would receive what they requested. Before the crown was placed on any man's head, however, Samuel was commanded to warn them. A king would not only lead, he would take. He would take their sons and place them in his army. Some would drive chariots, some would serve as horsemen, others would run before the royal procession. He would appoint commanders and force men to plow royal fields, harvest royal crops, and manufacture weapons. He would take their daughters to prepare perfumes, cook food, and serve in the palace. He would take the best fields, vineyards, and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He would demand portions of their grain, their flocks, and their wealth. He would transform free families into instruments of the royal administration. Samuel's warning exposed the cost hidden beneath the image of the crown. The people imagined a king who would fight for them. Samuel described a king who might also use them. Political power could defend a nation, but it could also consume it. A throne could bring unity, but it could become a center of oppression. Israel wanted to resemble the nations around them, and Samuel warned that they might receive not only the strength of those nations, but also their burdens. The people refused to reconsider. No, they insisted, "There shall be a king over us." Their desire was clear. They wanted a ruler they could see, an army they could measure, and a government that resembled the kingdoms surrounding them. God told Samuel to appoint their king. At that moment, the biblical story shifted. Israel was moving from the age of judges into the age of monarchy. The decision would shape the nation for centuries. It would produce moments of courage, worship, justice, and extraordinary victory. It would also produce tyranny, idolatry, civil war, assassination, and exile. The history of Israel's kings did not begin in a palace. It began with a warning. Far from Samuel's public confrontation with the elders, an ordinary family faced an ordinary problem. A wealthy Benjaminite named Kish had lost several donkeys. He sent his son Saul with a servant to search for them. Saul did not yet look like a tragic king. He was a young man carrying out a family responsibility. The text describes him as impressive in appearance. He stood taller than the other men of Israel. In a society searching for a visible warrior leader, Saul looked like the answer. He and the servant traveled through several regions but could not find the animals.
Eventually, Saul wanted to return, fearing that his father would stop worrying about the donkeys and begin worrying about him. The servant suggested consulting a man of God who lived nearby. That man was Samuel. What appeared to be a failed search had brought Saul to the place where his life would change. Before Saul arrived, the Lord had already told Samuel that a man from Benjamin would come. Samuel was to anoint him as ruler, and this ruler would begin delivering Israel from Philistine oppression. When Samuel saw Saul, he recognized the man God had identified. Saul, however, understood none of this. He approached Samuel, asking for directions to the seer's house, not realizing that he was speaking to the very prophet he sought. Samuel invited him to a meal and told him not to worry about the missing donkeys. They had already been found. Then he spoke words Saul could hardly have expected, implying that the desire of Israel was turning toward him and his father's household. Saul responded with astonishment. He came from Benjamin, one of Israel's smallest tribes. His clan was not among Benjamin's most important families. Why would Samuel speak to him in such a way the next morning, away from the crowd? Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it over Saul's head. He kissed him and declared that the Lord had anointed him as ruler over his inheritance. This was not yet a public coronation, it was a private calling. The young man who had left home searching for animals had been marked as Israel's first king. Samuel gave Saul signs that would confirm the word. He would meet men who would tell him the donkeys had been found. He would receive bread from travelers. Then he would encounter a group of prophets, and the Spirit of the Lord would come powerfully upon him. The signs occurred. Saul began to prophesy, astonishing those who knew him. God had changed his heart and equipped him for the responsibility ahead. The future appeared open before him. Yet when Saul returned home, he did not tell his family everything Samuel had said. He mentioned the donkeys, but remained silent about the kingdom. Soon Samuel summoned the tribes to Mizpah. There before the nation, he reminded Israel of what their request meant. The God who had brought them out of Egypt and delivered them from kingdoms and oppressors had been rejected in favor of a human king. Then the selection proceeded publicly. The tribe of Benjamin was chosen. From Benjamin, the clan of Matri was selected. Finally, Saul, son of Kish, was identified. But Saul could not be found. The man who stood taller than everyone else was hiding among the baggage. The scene revealed the tension already present within him. Saul possessed the appearance of a king, and the Spirit had empowered him, but he had not yet developed the inner steadiness the throne would demand. When the people brought him forward, he stood above them all. Samuel declared, "Do you see the one the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people." The crowd shouted, "Long live the king!" Israel finally had what it had requested. But not everyone accepted Saul. Some questioned how this man could save them and refused to honor him. Saul remained silent. His kingship had been announced, but it had not yet been proven. That test came from the east. Nahash the Ammonite besieged Jabesh-Gilead. The inhabitants offered to surrender and serve him, but Nahash demanded a brutal condition. He would gouge out the right eye of every man, bringing disgrace upon all Israel. The elders of Jabesh asked for 7 days to seek help. Messengers carried the news across the land. When they reached Saul's town, the people wept openly. Saul was returning from the field behind his oxen when he heard the crying and asked what had happened. After learning of the threat,
the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him. Saul's anger burned. He cut his oxen into pieces and sent them throughout Israel with a warning: any man who refused to follow Saul and Samuel would see the same done to his own animals.
The fear of the Lord fell upon the people, and the tribes gathered as one. For the first time, Saul acted with the authority Israel had hoped to see. He organized the forces, crossed into the territory of Jabesh-Gilead, and attacked the Ammonite camp during the morning watch. The enemy was scattered so completely that no two survivors remained together. The city was delivered. The victory changed Saul's position overnight. Those who had doubted him were now seen as traitors. Some of Saul's supporters demanded their execution, but Saul refused. "No one shall be put to death this day," he declared, "for today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel." It was a moment of restraint, humility, and clarity. Saul did not use his first major victory to destroy his critics. He recognized that the deliverance belonged to God. Samuel then gathered the people at Gilgal, where the kingdom was renewed. Sacrifices were offered, Saul was confirmed as king, and Israel celebrated with great joy. The tribes had been united. An enemy had been defeated. A rejected candidate had become a national hero. The monarchy seemed to have begun with promise. Yet Samuel's warning still hung over the celebration. Israel now had a king with the stature of a warrior, the support of the people, and the power to command an army. But the true test of Israel's monarchy would never be appearance, popularity, or victory. It would be obedience. And soon, Saul would be forced to choose between waiting for God and protecting his own authority. Saul's first victory had given Israel exactly what it wanted. The tribes had rallied behind one leader. The Ammonites had been defeated. A king stood at the center of the nation, able to summon an army and confront Israel's enemies. At Gilgal, the people celebrated. Sacrifices were offered, and Saul's rule was publicly confirmed. For a brief moment, the monarchy appeared to have solved Israel's crisis. But the battle at Jabesh-Gilead had tested Saul's courage. The trials ahead would test something deeper. Would he remain under the authority of the God who had raised him up? Or would the pressure of kingship lead him to trust his own judgment? Samuel gathered the people once more and gave what sounded like a farewell address, though his prophetic ministry was far from finished. He reminded Israel that he had not used his office to enrich himself. He had not taken their oxen, donkeys, land, or money. No one could accuse him of bribery or oppression. The contrast was deliberate. Samuel had warned that kings would take. Now, before Saul's reign fully unfolded, Samuel stood before the nation as a leader who had not taken from them. He then recounted Israel's history. Again and again the people had forgotten the Lord, suffered under enemies, cried out, and received deliverance. Their request for a king had not erased this pattern. A crown could not protect Israel if the nation and its ruler abandoned the covenant. To make the warning unmistakable, Samuel called upon the Lord, and thunder and rain came during the wheat harvest, a season when such weather was unusual. The people trembled. They realized that their demand for a king had not been a politically neutral decision. They begged Samuel to pray for them. Samuel assured them that he would not cease interceding, but he also gave them a condition that would define the entire history of Israel's monarchy. If the people and the king feared the Lord, served him, and obeyed his voice, they could continue under his favor. But if they rebelled, the same hand that had opposed their ancestors would oppose them. The monarchy was now established, but the king was not independent. Saul ruled Israel. God still ruled Saul. That truth was soon tested by the Philistines. The Philistines remained Israel's most immediate military threat. Their forces possessed chariots, cavalry, trained soldiers, and control over metalworking that left many Israelites without proper weapons. At a critical moment,
Only Saul and his son Jonathan are described as having swords or spears. Jonathan struck a Philistine outpost, provoking a much larger response. The Philistines assembled an enormous force, and fear spread through Israel. Men hid in caves, thickets, pits, and rocky crevices. Others crossed the Jordan to escape. Saul gathered the remaining troops at Gilgal.
Samuel had instructed him to wait 7 days.
The prophet would come, offer sacrifices, and provide direction. Saul waited, but as the days passed, the army began to scatter. Every departing soldier made the king appear weaker. The Philistines were gathering. Samuel had not yet arrived. The danger was visible, immediate, and political. Saul faced the kind of moment that reveals what a ruler truly trusts. He ordered that the burnt offering be brought to him. Then Saul offered the sacrifice himself. As soon as he finished, Samuel arrived.
Saul went out to greet him, but Samuel did not respond with approval.
"What have you done?" Saul explained. "The people were scattering. The Philistines were assembling." Samuel had not arrived within the expected time. Saul had not yet sought the Lord's favor, so he felt compelled to offer the sacrifice. His explanation was understandable. That was precisely what made the moment so revealing. Saul did not abandon worship. He used worship to justify disobedience. He did not deny God's importance.
He acted as though the pressure of the crisis gave him the right to ignore God's command. Samuel told him that he had acted foolishly. Had Saul obeyed, his dynasty might have been established over Israel. But now his kingdom would not endure. The Lord would seek a man after his own heart and appoint him ruler over his people. The statement did not mean Saul immediately lost the throne. He would continue ruling. He would fight battles, command armies, and be recognized as king. But the future of his house had been cut off. A divide now appeared between possessing power and possessing God's approval. Saul still wore the crown, but the dynasty was already slipping away. The military situation remained desperate. Philistine raiding parties moved through the land, and Israel's army was poorly equipped. Yet Jonathan, Saul's son, displayed the courage and faith that the king himself was struggling to maintain. Without telling Saul, Jonathan and his armor-bearer approached a Philistine outpost. The soldiers were positioned above a steep, rocky passage. From a military perspective, 2 men climbing toward an armed enemy had little chance of success. Jonathan did not claim certainty that God was obligated to rescue them. Instead, he expressed trust in what God was capable of doing. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Jonathan and his armor-bearer climbed upward. The Philistines mocked them and called them forward. Jonathan took this as the sign he had requested. The 2 men attacked. The outpost fell into confusion. Panic spread through the Philistine camp. The ground shook, and what began as the action of 2 men became a wider collapse. Saul's watchmen saw the enemy forces scattering. Israel joined the battle. But even during victory, Saul's leadership created unnecessary danger. He placed the army under an oath forbidding anyone to eat before evening until he had taken revenge on his enemies. The command sounded determined, but it left exhausted soldiers without strength. Jonathan had not heard the oath. When he found honey in the forest, he ate and his strength returned. After learning of his father's command, Jonathan recognized its foolishness. If the troops had been allowed to eat, the victory might have been even greater. Later, when Saul sought divine guidance and received no answer, he assumed someone had sinned. Through the process of casting lots, Jonathan was identified. He admitted that he had eaten honey. Saul declared that Jonathan must die. The king who had once spared his critics after the victory at Jabesh-Gilead was now prepared to execute his own son for unknowingly violating a reckless command. The army intervened. The people refused to allow the man through whom God had brought such a great victory to be killed.
Jonathan was rescued from Saul's sentence. The incident revealed a disturbing change. Saul was becoming increasingly concerned with enforcing his own words, even when those words placed the nation in danger. His authority was beginning to matter more to him than wisdom. Still, Saul remained an active military king. He fought against Moab, Ammon, Edom, the kings of Zobah, the Philistines, and Amalek. He gathered strong and capable men into his service. Israel became more organized under his leadership. The Bible does not present Saul as a man without ability. His tragedy was not that he lacked every quality required for kingship. His tragedy was that his strength was not matched by enduring obedience. The decisive test came through a command concerning Amalek. The Amalekites had attacked Israel's vulnerable people during the journey from Egypt. Samuel now instructed Saul to carry out judgment against them. Saul assembled the army and defeated Amalek, but he did not fully obey the command. He spared Agag, the Amalekite king. He also kept the best sheep, cattle, lambs, and valuable possessions. Only what was despised and weak was destroyed. That night the word of the Lord came to Samuel. God declared that he regretted making Saul king because Saul had turned away and had not carried out his command. The language expresses divine grief over Saul's rebellion. The king had been chosen, empowered, warned, and given repeated opportunities. Yet he continued to place his own judgment above the word he had received. Samuel was deeply distressed and cried out through the night. The next morning he went to meet Saul. Before Samuel arrived, Saul had already traveled to Carmel and set up a monument in his own honor. The detail is brief, but it exposes the direction of Saul's heart. The king who once hid among the baggage was now building a public memorial to himself. When he saw Samuel, Saul greeted him with confidence. "May you be blessed by the Lord. I have carried out the Lord's command." Then Samuel heard the animals. "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" Saul blamed the people. They had spared the best animals, he said, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord. Everything else had been destroyed. Samuel stopped him. He reminded Saul that when he had once seemed small in his own eyes, he had been made head over the tribes of Israel. God had sent him on a specific mission. Why had he not obeyed? Saul continued defending himself. He had gone where he was sent. He had brought back Agag, but the army had taken the animals for sacrifice. Samuel's answer became one of the defining declarations of Israel's royal history. To obey is better than sacrifice. Religious activity could not compensate for rebellion. A king could not take what God had forbidden, label it an offering, and call his actions faithful. Samuel compared rebellion to divination and arrogance to idolatry. Because Saul had rejected the word of the Lord had rejected him as king. Only then did Saul admit that he had sinned. But even his confession revealed his deepest fear. He explained that he had been afraid of the people and had listened to them. Then he asked Samuel to honor him before the elders and return with him so he could worship publicly. Saul feared losing the appearance of legitimacy. Samuel turned to leave. Saul seized the edge of Samuel's robe and it tore. Samuel looked at the torn fabric and declared that the Lord had torn the kingdom of Israel from Saul and would give it to one better than him. The judgment was now unmistakable. Saul begged again for public honor. Samuel eventually returned with him, and Saul bowed before the Lord. But the relationship between the king and the prophet had changed permanently. Samuel executed Agag, completing the judgment Saul had refused to carry out. Then Samuel returned to Ramah, while Saul went home to Gibeah. They would not meet again during Samuel's lifetime. Samuel mourned for Saul. The failure of Israel's first king was not treated as a reason for celebration.
Saul's fall was tragic because his reign had begun with genuine opportunity. He had been chosen, empowered, victorious, and capable of humility. But grief could not become paralysis. The Lord told Samuel to fill his horn with oil and go to Bethlehem. One of the sons of Jesse had been chosen as the next king. Samuel feared that Saul would kill him if he learned of the mission. He was instructed to go under the purpose of offering a sacrifice and to invite Jesse's family. When Samuel arrived, the elders of Bethlehem trembled, uncertain whether the prophet came in peace. Samuel consecrated Jesse and his sons. As the sons passed before him, Samuel saw Eliab and assumed that the Lord's anointed stood there. Eliab appeared impressive, but God corrected the prophet. Human beings look at outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart. The words directly challenged the standard that had made Saul so appealing. Saul had stood taller than the people. He looked like a king. The next king would not be identified by appearance alone. Abinadab passed before Samuel. He was not chosen. Then Shammah. He was not chosen. 7 of Jesse's sons came forward, but none was the one God had selected. Samuel asked whether Jesse had any more sons. There was still the youngest. He was keeping the sheep. David had not even been invited to stand with his brothers. In the eyes of his family, he did not seem like an obvious candidate for royal anointing. Samuel refused to proceed until he arrived. David was brought in from the fields. The text describes him as healthy and striking in appearance, with bright eyes. Yet, unlike Saul's selection, the emphasis was not merely on what the people could see. The Lord told Samuel, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." Samuel poured oil over David in the presence of his brothers. From that day, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The anointing was real, but it did not immediately give David a throne, an army, or a palace. He returned to a life that still involved sheep family duties and obscurity. Meanwhile, the Spirit's empowering presence departed from Saul, and he became troubled by a harmful spirit. His servants suggested finding a skilled musician who could play the lyre and calm him. One servant knew of a young man from Bethlehem. David was described as a skillful musician, a brave man, a warrior, a good speaker, and someone with a strong presence. Most importantly, the servant said that the Lord was with him. The rejected king now summoned the anointed successor into his own household, without understanding who David truly was. David entered Saul's service. When Saul was tormented, David played, and relief came. Saul loved him greatly and made him an armor-bearer. For a time, the relationship seemed peaceful. David served, Saul received comfort. The future king stood near the present king, but the crown remained where it was. Then the Philistines gathered for war in the valley of Elah. Their army occupied one ridge, while Israel stood on the opposite side. Between them lay the valley. From the Philistine ranks came a champion named Goliath of Gath. He was enormous, heavily armored and armed with weapons suited for a professional warrior. Day after day he challenged Israel to send one man to fight him. The outcome would determine which nation served the other. Saul and the army were terrified. David was not initially present as a soldier. His older brothers had joined Saul's forces while David moved between the royal court and his father's sheep. Jesse sent him to the camp with food and instructions to bring back news. When David arrived, he heard Goliath's challenge. He also heard the fear of Israel. David asked what would be done for the man who defeated the Philistine and removed the disgrace from Israel. His concern was not only national pride. He was disturbed that an uncircumcised Philistine was defying the armies of the living God. Eliab, David's oldest brother, became angry. He accused David of pride and of abandoning the sheep merely to watch the battle. David's words were reported to Saul. The king sent for him. David told Saul that no one should lose heart because of Goliath. He would fight. Saul objected. David was young. Goliath had been a warrior from his youth. David responded by describing the dangers he had faced as a shepherd. When a lion or bear carried away a sheep, he pursued it. He struck the animal and rescued the flock. If it turned against him, he seized it and killed it. The same God who delivered him from lion and bear, David believed, would deliver him from the Philistine. Saul agreed. "Go, and may the Lord be with you." He dressed David in royal armor, placed a bronze helmet on his head, and gave him a sword. David tried to move but was unaccustomed to the equipment. He removed it. The future king would not win by imitating Saul. David took his staff, selected 5 smooth stones from the stream, placed them in his shepherd's bag, and approached Goliath with a sling in his hand. Goliath saw him and was insulted. He cursed David and promised to leave his body for birds and wild animals. David answered that Goliath came with sword, spear, and javelin, but he came in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel's armies. The battle belonged to the Lord. As Goliath moved forward, David ran toward the battle line. He placed a stone in the sling, released it, and struck the Philistine in the forehead. Goliath fell face down. David took the giant's own sword and killed him. The Philistine army fled. Israel pursued. A confrontation that had paralyzed an entire army was ended by a young shepherd who trusted God more than he feared the enemy. David's victory transformed his life. Saul placed him over military forces, and he succeeded wherever he was sent. The people approved of him. The officers respected him. Jonathan formed a deep bond with David. He gave David his robe, tunic, sword, bow, and belt, symbols that carried extraordinary meaning coming from the king's son. Jonathan was the natural heir to Saul's throne. Yet he recognized something in David and loved him as himself. Saul saw something else. When the army returned from battle, women came out from Israel's towns with singing and dancing. "Saul has slain his thousands," they sang, "and David his tens of thousands." Saul became furious. The song did not remove his crown, but he heard it as a prophecy of replacement. David had received greater praise. What more could he gain except the kingdom? From that day forward, Saul watched David with suspicion. The young man who had calmed Saul's spirit now became the focus of his fear. The next day, as David played the lyre, Saul held a spear. Overcome by rage, he hurled it toward David, intending to pin him to the wall. David escaped. Saul was afraid of him because the Lord was with David and had departed from Saul. That was the true source of the king's terror. Saul still possessed the palace, the army, and the title. David possessed the presence Saul had lost. Saul removed him from the court and appointed him as a military commander, perhaps hoping that repeated battles would eventually kill him. But David continued to succeed, and his popularity grew. Saul offered his daughter Merab to David secretly, expecting the Philistines to destroy him. When that plan failed, Saul learned that his daughter Michal loved David. He saw another opportunity. The bride price would not be money. David was asked to bring evidence of victory over 100 Philistines. Saul assumed the mission would be fatal. David returned with twice the required number. Michal became his wife. Saul now understood that the Lord was with David and that his own daughter loved him. His fear became permanent hostility. He openly ordered Jonathan and his servants to kill David. Jonathan warned David and spoke to Saul in his defense. He reminded his father that David had risked his life against Goliath and brought a great victory to Israel. David had done nothing deserving death.
Saul listened temporarily and swore that David would not be killed. David returned to court. But the cycle resumed. Another war came. David defeated the Philistines. Saul's jealousy returned. Once again he threw a spear while David played. Once again, David escaped. Saul sent men to watch David's house and kill him in the morning. Michal warned her husband that he would die unless he fled that night.
She lowered him through a window and placed an idol in the bed to delay the soldiers. David escaped to Samuel at Ramah. Saul sent men to seize him, but they began to prophesy. A second group was sent, then a third, with the same result. Finally, Saul himself went. He too was overcome and prophesied. The king could send soldiers, he could issue decrees, he could pursue David across the land, but he could not overturn what God had declared. David returned secretly and met Jonathan. He asked what crime he had committed that caused Saul to seek his life. Jonathan struggled to believe his father would hide such a plan from him. Together they devised a test during the new moon feast. David would be absent. Jonathan would observe Saul's reaction. When Saul realized David was missing, he demanded an explanation. Jonathan said that David had asked permission to attend a family sacrifice in Bethlehem. Saul's rage erupted against his own son. He accused Jonathan of choosing David to the shame of his family. As long as David lived, Saul declared neither Jonathan nor his kingdom would be secure. "Send and bring him to me, for he must die." Jonathan asked why. Saul hurled a spear at him. Now Jonathan knew the truth. His father was willing to kill even the son whose future he claimed to be protecting. The next morning, Jonathan met David in the field. The two men wept together. Jonathan did not cling to his place as heir. He entered a covenant with David, asking that their bond extend to their descendants. Then David left. The anointed future king became a fugitive. He went first to Nob, where Ahimelech the priest gave him consecrated bread and the sword of Goliath. David did not fully explain his situation, presenting himself as if he were on a royal mission. A servant of Saul named Doeg the Edomite witnessed the meeting. David then fled to Gath, the Philistine city associated with Goliath. There, recognized as Israel's celebrated warrior, he feared for his life and pretended to be insane before King Achish. From the victory field of Elah, David had fallen into a life of desperation. He escaped to the cave of Adullam. His brothers and father's household joined him. So did men who were distressed, indebted, or bitter in soul. About 400 gathered around him. This was not yet the royal army of a secure monarch. It was a community of fugitives, outcasts, and desperate men. David became their leader. Saul, meanwhile, sat beneath a tree at Gibeah with spear in hand, surrounded by officials. He accused his servants of conspiring against him. Would David give them fields and vineyards? Would he make them commanders? Why had no one informed him of Jonathan's covenant? Doeg revealed that he had seen David with Ahimelech. Saul summoned the priests of Nob. Ahimelech defended David. As far as he knew, David was Saul's faithful son-in-law, commander, and honored servant. He had no knowledge of rebellion. Saul ordered the priests killed. The king's guards refused to strike the priests of the Lord. Doeg obeyed. He killed 85 priests and then attacked Nob, destroying men, women, children, infants, cattle, donkeys, and sheep. Only Abiathar, a son of Ahimelech, escaped and joined David. When David heard what had happened, he accepted responsibility for recognizing the danger posed by Doeg. He promised Abiathar protection. Saul, who had spared the Amalekite king against God's command, had now slaughtered Israel's priests because of his own fear. The tragedy of his reign had deepened into violence against his own people. David's years as a fugitive were filled with danger, but they also became the period in which his character was repeatedly tested.
He rescued the town of Keilah from the Philistines, only to learn that its inhabitants would surrender him to Saul. He fled into the wilderness. Jonathan found him and strengthened him in God. Jonathan told David not to be afraid. Saul would not find him. David would become king, and Jonathan would be second to him. Even Saul, Jonathan said, knew this. Jonathan returned home. The two friends would meet only once more before Jonathan's death. The pursuit continued through wilderness strongholds, deserts, forests, and rocky regions. Saul came close to capturing David more than once. At one point, Saul entered a cave to relieve himself, unaware that David and his men were hiding deep inside. David's followers believed the opportunity had been given by God. Here was the enemy who had hunted him, threatened his family, murdered priests, and driven him from home. David could end the conflict with one strike. Instead, he crept forward and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Even that action troubled his conscience. David refused to attack the Lord's anointed. He would not seize the kingdom by murdering the man who currently held the throne. After Saul left the cave, David called out. He bowed and showed the piece of robe. He asked why Saul believed those who said David wanted to harm him. The evidence was in David's hand. He had been close enough to kill the king and had refused. David appealed to God as judge between them. Saul wept. For a moment he acknowledged the truth. David was more righteous than he was. David had repaid evil with good. Saul confessed that he knew David would become king and that the kingdom would be established in his hands. He asked David to swear that he would not destroy Saul's descendants. David swore. But the reconciliation did not last. Saul returned to the pursuit. On another occasion, David and Abishai entered Saul's camp at night. The king lay sleeping with his spear beside his head, surrounded by soldiers. Abishai saw a perfect opportunity. He asked permission to kill Saul with one thrust. David refused. No one, he said, could strike the Lord's anointed and remain guiltless. Saul's life would end in God's time, through natural death, battle, or another judgment, but David would not take the throne by bloodshed. He took Saul's spear and water jug and left the camp. From a distance, David called out and exposed the failure of Abner, Saul's commander, to guard the king. Saul recognized David's voice. Again he admitted that he had sinned. Again he called David his son. Again he promised that David would succeed. But David no longer trusted Saul's promises. He concluded that one day he would die by Saul's hand unless he escaped beyond Israel's territory. David went to the Philistines and entered the service of Achish, king of Gath. He was given Ziklag as a base and lived there with his men and their families. To survive, David operated within a morally dangerous and politically complicated world. He conducted raids while giving Achish the impression that he was attacking Judah. Achish came to trust him and believed David had made himself permanently hated among his own people. When the Philistines assembled for a major campaign against Israel, Achish expected David to accompany them. David now stood in a perilous position. The future king of Israel appeared ready to march with Israel's enemies against Saul, but the Philistine commanders distrusted him. They remembered the songs about David's victories and feared that he would turn against them during the battle. Achish reluctantly sent him back to Ziklag. When David and his men arrived, they found the town burned. The Amalekites had raided it. Their wives, sons, and daughters had been taken captive. David's men wept until they had no strength left. In their grief, they spoke of stoning him. David had lost his home. His family was gone. His followers blamed him. Yet in this moment, the text says that David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. He sought divine direction, pursued the raiders, defeated them, and recovered everyone and everything that had been taken. No one was missing. At the same time, far to the north, Saul faced the final crisis of his reign. The Philistines gathered at Shunem. Israel camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the enemy army, he was terrified. He sought guidance from the Lord, but received no answer through dreams, priests, or prophets. Samuel was dead. Saul had removed mediums and spiritists from the land. Yet now, in desperation, he disguised himself and sought a medium at Endor. The king who had repeatedly refused the clear word of God now searched for forbidden knowledge when God seemed silent. The woman was afraid it was a trap, but Saul swore she would not be punished. He asked her to bring up Samuel. What followed terrified her. Samuel appeared and asked Saul why he had disturbed him. Saul described the crisis. The Philistines were attacking. God had turned away. There was no answer. Samuel told him that the outcome had already been declared. Because Saul had not obeyed, the kingdom had been torn from him and given to David. Israel would be defeated. Saul and his sons would die. The king collapsed. The next day, battle swept across Mount Gilboa. Israel's army fled. The Philistines pursued. Saul's sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua were killed. Jonathan died fighting beside the father whose throne he knew he would never inherit. The archers found Saul and wounded him severely. He ordered his armor-bearer to kill him before the Philistines could capture and abuse him. The armor-bearer was afraid and refused. Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. When the armor-bearer saw that the king was dead, he also fell on his sword. Israel's first monarchy ended on a battlefield. The man who had once stood taller than everyone else now lay among the dead on Mount Gilboa. His sons were gone. His army had scattered. The Philistines occupied Israelite towns. The next day the enemy found the bodies. They cut off Saul's head, stripped his armor, and displayed his body with those of his sons on the wall of Bethshan. But the men of Jabesh Gilead remembered. Years earlier, Saul had rescued their city from Nahash the Ammonite. Now their warriors traveled through the night, recovered the bodies, and gave them an honorable burial. Saul's story ended where his kingship had first been confirmed with the gratitude of Jabesh Gilead. News of the battle soon reached David. The fugitive Saul had tried to kill was now the anointed leader best positioned to take the throne. Jonathan, David's closest friend, was dead. The path to kingship had opened, but David did not celebrate. He tore his clothes. His men did the same. They mourned, wept, and fasted for Saul, Jonathan, and the fallen army of Israel. Then David composed a lament. He remembered Saul and Jonathan not only through the darkness of their final years, but as warriors who had defended Israel. He called upon the daughters of Israel to weep for Saul. He mourned Jonathan with words of profound grief. How the mighty have fallen! The line captured more than the death of two men. Saul had risen from obscurity, received the Spirit, delivered a city, united the tribes, and become Israel's first king. But fear, pride, impatience, and disobedience had consumed the promise of his reign. Jonathan had possessed the courage, faith, and loyalty his father increasingly lacked. He had accepted that the throne would pass to David, yet remained faithful to both his friend and his family. Now both were gone. David had refused to take the kingdom by force. But the death of Saul did not automatically unite Israel beneath him. The Philistines remained powerful. Saul's household still had surviving supporters. The tribes were divided. Old loyalties had not disappeared with the king's death. David had been anointed years earlier. Now he would have to learn whether receiving a promise was the same as possessing a kingdom. David had been anointed years earlier. Samuel had poured oil over his head while Saul still occupied the throne. Since then, David had defeated Goliath, served in the royal court, commanded soldiers, survived assassination attempts, lived as a fugitive, led desperate men through the wilderness, and refused more than once to kill Saul when the opportunity was placed before him. Now Saul was dead. But David did not assume that the promise gave him permission to act without direction. He asked the Lord where he should go. The answer was Hebron, a city in the hill country of Judah. David moved there with his wives, his household, and the men who had followed him through exile. Their families settled in the surrounding towns. Then the leaders of Judah came and anointed David as king over their tribe. It was the beginning of his public reign, but it was not yet the United Kingdom. David ruled Judah in the south. In the north and east, loyalty to Saul's house remained strong. Abner, the commander of Saul's army, took Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth and established him as king over much of Israel. The nation now had two kings. David ruled from Hebron. Ishbosheth ruled from Mahanaim. The conflict that followed was not simply a struggle between strangers. These were tribes bound by shared ancestry covenants and history. Men who should have fought beside one another now stood on opposite sides of a divided nation. David's first public act after Saul's death was not revenge. He sent a message to the men of Jabesh Gilead, praising them for recovering and burying Saul's body. He asked that the Lord show them faithfulness and kindness. He also reminded them that Judah had anointed him king. The message was both gracious and political. David honored Saul while quietly announcing that a new reign had begun. Abner, however, was not prepared to surrender the north. At the pool of Gibeon, soldiers loyal to Ishbosheth met forces led by Joab, David's military commander and nephew. The confrontation began with a contest between selected young warriors. It quickly turned into slaughter. All 24 men involved in the contest killed one another. Then a larger battle erupted. Abner's forces were defeated and he fled. Asahel, Joab's younger brother, pursued him. Asahel was known for his speed and refused to turn aside. Abner warned him repeatedly. He did not want to kill the brother of Joab, knowing the consequences that would follow. But Asahel continued the pursuit. Finally, Abner struck him with the end of his spear. Asahel died where he fell. The death planted a personal blood feud inside an already dangerous civil war. The fighting between the house of Saul and the house of David continued for years. David's position grew stronger while Saul's household weakened. Yet David's rise was not without moral complexity. During his years in Hebron, he took additional wives and fathered several sons. In the political world of the ancient Near East, royal marriages could strengthen alliances and expand influence. But they also created competing households, divided loyalties, and rival claims to succession. The family structure forming around David would eventually become one of the greatest sources of instability in his kingdom. Meanwhile, Ishbosheth's authority depended heavily on Abner. When the king accused Abner of sleeping with one of Saul's concubines, Abner became furious. In royal politics, taking a former king's concubine could be interpreted as a claim to the throne. Whether the accusation was true or not, Abner considered it an insult after everything he had done to preserve Saul's dynasty. He declared that he would transfer the kingdom to David. Abner contacted David and offered to bring all Israel under his rule. David agreed to negotiate, but demanded the return of Michal, Saul's daughter and David's first wife. Saul had taken her from David and given her to another man during the years of persecution. Ishbosheth ordered that she be returned. Her second husband followed behind her weeping until Abner commanded him to go home. The scene reveals the human cost hidden beneath royal alliances. Michal's life had been moved by the decisions of kings and commanders. Her restoration to David carried political meaning, reconnecting him visibly to Saul's household. But the text does not present the moment as a joyful reunion. Abner then met with Israel's elders. He reminded them that they had previously desired David as king and urged them to act. He also spoke with the tribe of Benjamin, Saul's own tribe, attempting to secure their support. Afterward, Abner traveled to Hebron with 20 men. David held a feast for him. Abner promised to gather all Israel and establish a covenant with David so that he could rule the nation as the people desired. David sent him away in peace. Then Joab returned from a military raid. When he learned that Abner had visited Hebron and departed safely, he confronted David. Joab claimed that Abner had come as a spy, but beneath the accusation was the unresolved death of Asahel. Without David's knowledge, Joab sent messengers to bring Abner back. When Abner returned, Joab took him aside near the city gate as though to speak privately. There he stabbed him in the stomach. Abner died in revenge for Asahel. The murder threatened David's attempt to unite the tribes. Abner had been the strongest bridge between David and northern Israel. If the people believed David had arranged the killing, the civil war could deepen. David publicly declared himself innocent. He pronounced judgment upon Joab's household, though he did not remove Joab permanently from power. David ordered the people to mourn. He followed Abner's bier, wept at the grave, and composed a lament. David fasted until evening, refusing food despite pressure from the people. His grief convinced Israel that he had not ordered the assassination. David acknowledged that although he had been anointed king, he was still politically weak. Joab and his brother Abishai were too powerful for him to control fully. The admission exposed an important tension in David's reign. He possessed the crown, but some of the violent men who had helped him survive were becoming difficult to restrain. When Ishbosheth heard that Abner was dead, he lost courage. Israel was alarmed. 2 of his own military captains entered his house while he rested and murdered him. They cut off his head and carried it to David, expecting a reward. Instead, David condemned them. He remembered the man who had claimed to kill Saul and expected payment. David had executed that messenger for raising his hand against the Lord's anointed. These men had murdered an innocent man in his own bed. David ordered their execution. Ishbosheth's head was buried in Abner's tomb. Once again, David refused to build his kingdom by approving the murder of a rival. With Ishbosheth dead and Abner gone, the elders of all Israel came to David at Hebron. They acknowledged their shared identity. "We are your own flesh and blood." They remembered that even during Saul's reign, David had led Israel's military campaigns. More importantly, they recognized that the Lord had called him to shepherd Israel and become its ruler. A covenant was made. The elders anointed David king over all Israel. He was 30 years old when his reign began and would rule for 40 years, 7.5 years over Judah from Hebron and 33 years over the United Kingdom from Jerusalem. The tribes were finally under one crown. But David needed a capital that did not belong exclusively to either the northern tribes or to his own tribe of Judah. He turned toward Jerusalem. At that time, the city was controlled by the Jebusites. Its elevated position and strong defenses made it appear nearly impossible to capture. The inhabitants mocked David, claiming that even the blind and lame could keep him out. David's forces entered the stronghold. The details of the assault are brief and interpreted in different ways, but the result was decisive. The fortress fell, and David established his residence there. Jerusalem became known as the City of David. Its location was politically strategic. It stood near the border between Judah and Benjamin. It had not previously served as the central possession of one dominant Israelite tribe. By making Jerusalem the capital, David created a new center around which the United Kingdom could gather. He built up the city, and his power continued to grow. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons to build David a palace. The gesture revealed David's growing international recognition. The former shepherd now lived in a royal house. The fugitive from Saul's court now ruled from a fortified capital. David recognized that the Lord had established him as king not merely for his own greatness, but for the sake of Israel. The Philistines understood the danger immediately. When they heard that David had been anointed over all Israel, they marched out to confront him. The man who had once served among them now commanded the united tribes. David did not assume that past victories guaranteed future success. He asked the Lord whether he should attack. He received direction, went into battle, and defeated them. When the Philistines returned, David sought guidance again. This time, the strategy changed. He was instructed not to attack directly, but to circle behind them. The victories secured David's rule and weakened the enemy that had threatened Israel since the days of the judges. But David wanted Jerusalem to become more than a political and military center. He wanted the Ark of the Covenant brought into the city. The Ark represented the covenant presence and kingship of God among Israel. It had remained outside the national center since the disastrous days when it was captured by the Philistines. David gathered thousands of chosen men and set out to bring it from the house of Abinadab. The ark was placed on a new cart. Uzzah and Ahio guided it while David and Israel celebrated with songs and instruments. Then the oxen stumbled. Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark. He died there. The celebration stopped. David became angry and afraid. He asked how the ark could come to him. Instead of continuing to Jerusalem, he left it at the house of Obed-Edom. For 3 months, the household of Obed-Edom was blessed. David then prepared to move the ark again, this time with greater attention to the holiness and instructions surrounding it. The chronicler emphasizes that the Levites carried it as the law required. Sacrifices were offered. David danced before the Lord with all his strength, wearing a linen garment rather than presenting himself only in royal splendor. The people shouted, and trumpets sounded as the ark entered Jerusalem. Michal watched from a window. She saw the king leaping and dancing and despised him in her heart. After David blessed the people and returned to bless his household, Michal confronted him with bitter sarcasm. She accused him of exposing himself before servant women in a way unworthy of a king. David answered that he had celebrated before the Lord who had chosen him instead of her father and Saul's household. He declared that he was willing to humble himself further. The conflict was deeply personal. Michal was Saul's daughter, David's wife, a woman once used in political arrangements and a living connection between two royal houses. Now the joy surrounding David's kingdom became another source of separation within his own family. The ark rested in Jerusalem. David lived in a palace of cedar while the ark remained inside a tent. He told Nathan the prophet that he wanted to build a permanent house for God. Nathan initially approved, but that night the word of the Lord came to him. David would not be the one to build the temple. Instead, God reminded David that he had taken him from tending sheep and made him ruler over Israel. He had been with David wherever he went and had defeated his enemies. Then the promise moved beyond David's lifetime. God would make David a great name. He would provide security for Israel. When David's days ended, one of his descendants would rise after him and establish his kingdom. That son would build the temple. God would establish the throne of his kingdom. The king could be disciplined when he sinned, but the covenant faithfulness shown to David's house would not be removed in the same way it had been removed from Saul. David's house, kingdom, and throne were given an enduring place in the biblical story. The promise did not mean every descendant of David would be righteous. It did not mean Jerusalem could never face judgment. The later history of Judah would prove otherwise. But from this point forward, the hope of Israel's kingship became tied to David's line. David entered the tent and sat before the Lord. He did not respond by celebrating his own greatness. "Who am I, O Lord God?" he asked, "and what is my house that you have brought me this far?" The shepherd understood that his rise could not be explained by background status or personal achievement alone. The promise was larger than the man who received it. David continued expanding and securing the kingdom. He subdued the Philistines, defeated Moab, fought the forces of Zobah and Damascus, and extended Israel's influence. Neighboring rulers sent tribute, garrisons were established, enemies who had once threatened Israel were pushed back. The text repeatedly explains David's success with the same central truth: the Lord gave him victory wherever he went. David administered justice and righteousness for all his people. At the height of his power, he remembered a covenant made long before. He asked whether anyone remained from Saul's household to whom he could show kindness for Jonathan's sake. A former servant of Saul, named Ziba, told him about Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, who had been disabled in both feet since childhood. Mephibosheth was summoned. As a surviving male descendant of Saul, he could have feared execution. In many royal transitions, former dynasties were eliminated to prevent future claims. Mephibosheth fell before David. David told him not to be afraid. He restored Saul's land to him and gave him a permanent place at the king's table. The kindness did not erase the suffering between Saul and David. It showed that David had not forgotten Jonathan after gaining the power Jonathan would never inherit. For a time, David's kingdom appeared secure. The tribes were united. Jerusalem was established. The ark was present. The Philistines were subdued. The royal covenant had been announced. Enemies paid tribute. Justice was administered. The king showed mercy to the house of Saul. It was the kind of moment at which a story might end in triumph. But David's greatest danger no longer stood outside Jerusalem's walls. It was growing within the king himself. When Nahash, king of the Ammonites, died, David attempted to show kindness to his son Hanun. David remembered the loyalty Nahash had previously shown him and sent messengers to express sympathy. Hanun's advisors convinced him that the messengers were spies. The Ammonites humiliated David's servants by shaving part of their beards and cutting their garments. Realizing they had provoked Israel, they hired Aramean forces for support. Joab led Israel's army into battle. Facing enemies on two sides, he divided the troops with Abishai. Israel defeated the coalition, and the conflict expanded. In the spring, when kings normally went out to war, David sent Joab and the army against the Ammonites. But David remained in Jerusalem. One evening he rose from his bed and walked on the roof of the palace. From there he saw a woman bathing. She was beautiful. David sent someone to ask who she was. The answer should have established a boundary. She was Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was one of David's soldiers, later listed among his mighty men. Bathsheba was not an unknown woman without connections to the royal circle. Her husband was away fighting in the king's war. David sent messengers and took her. She became pregnant. The king now faced the consequences of his action. Instead of confessing, he attempted to conceal it. David summoned Uriah from the battlefield under the pretense of receiving a military report. He asked how Joab and the soldiers were doing. Then he told Uriah to go home. David expected Uriah to sleep with his wife, so the pregnancy would appear to be his. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the palace among the king's servants. When David asked why he had not gone home, Uriah explained that the ark, Israel, Judah, Joab, and the army were living in tents and open fields. How could he go home to eat, drink, and lie with his wife? Uriah's loyalty exposed David's failure. The foreign-born soldier showed greater solidarity with Israel's army than Israel's king, who had remained behind and taken the soldier's wife. David kept him another day and made him drunk. Still, Uriah did not go home. Then David wrote a message to Joab. He placed the letter in Uriah's own hand. The message instructed Joab to place Uriah at the front where the fighting was fiercest, then withdraw so he would be struck down and killed. Uriah carried his death sentence back to the battlefield. Joab obeyed. During the assault near the Ammonite city, Uriah and other soldiers died. When Joab sent the battle report, he anticipated that David might be angry over the dangerous tactics. He instructed the messenger to add that Uriah was dead. The king's response was cold. He told Joab not to let the matter trouble him, because the sword devours one person and then another. Joab should strengthen the attack and destroy the city. Bathsheba mourned for her husband. After the period of mourning, David brought her into the palace, and she became his wife. She gave birth to a son. From the outside, the scandal appeared resolved. Uriah had died in war. The widow had been taken into the royal household. The child could now be recognized as David's. But the final sentence of the account removes every illusion. What David had done displeased the Lord. Nathan the prophet came to the king. He did not begin with a direct accusation. He told a story. 2 men lived in one city. One was rich, possessing many flocks and herds. The other was poor and owned only one small lamb. He had raised it with his children. It ate from his food, drank from his cup, and lay in his arms. The lamb was like a daughter to him. When a traveler came to the rich man, the wealthy man refused to take from his own flocks. Instead, he seized the poor man's lamb and prepared it for his guest. David burned with anger. He declared that the man deserved judgment and must repay the loss many times over because he had shown no pity. Nathan answered with 4 words, "You are the man." The story had placed David in the position of judge before revealing that he was judging himself. Nathan reminded him of everything God had given the throned Saul's household, the kingdom, and continuing favor. If that had been too little, more could have been provided. Why then had David despised the word of the Lord? He had taken Uriah's wife and killed Uriah through the sword of the Ammonites. The consequences would enter David's own house. The sword would not depart from his family. Evil would rise against him from within. What David had done secretly would produce public humiliation. David did not blame Bathsheba, Joab, political pressure, or the demands of kingship. "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan told him that his sin had been put away and that he would not die. But forgiveness did not erase every earthly consequence. The child became ill and died despite David's fasting and prayer. David later comforted Bathsheba, and she gave birth to Solomon, who was loved by the Lord. Yet the peace of the palace had been broken. The judgment Nathan announced began to unfold through David's children. David's son Amnon became obsessed with his half-sister Tamar, the sister of Absalom. Following the advice of a cousin, Amnon pretended to be ill and asked that Tamar come prepare food for him. When they were alone, he seized her. Tamar pleaded with him. She called the act disgraceful and urged him not to do such wickedness in Israel. She even appealed to him to speak with the king rather than violate her. Amnon refused to listen. He overpowered her. Afterward, his obsession turned instantly into hatred. He ordered her to leave. Tamar protested that sending her away added another wrong to what had already been done. Amnon called a servant and had her thrown out. Tamar tore the special robe worn by royal daughters, placed ashes on her head, and went away crying. Absalom learned what had happened. He took Tamar into his home, where she lived as a desolate woman. David heard and became furious, but the text records no decisive action against Amnon. The king, who administered justice for Israel, failed to bring justice inside his own household. Absalom said nothing publicly to Amnon, but he hated him. For 2 years the hatred remained hidden. Then Absalom arranged a feast during sheep shearing and invited the king's sons. David declined to attend. Absalom pressed him to send Amnon. During the feast, when Amnon's heart was merry with wine, Absalom's servants killed him. The remaining royal sons fled. A report reached David that Absalom had killed all the king's sons. David tore his garments and fell to the ground before the truth was clarified. Only Amnon was dead. Absalom fled to his maternal grandfather in Geshur and remained there for 3 years. David mourned for Amnon. Over time, his heart longed for Absalom, but longing did not produce reconciliation. Joab recognized the king's condition and arranged for a wise woman from Tekoa to present a fictional case. Through her story, David was led to see that continued separation from Absalom could threaten the future. David allowed Absalom to return to Jerusalem, but he refused to see him. For 2 more years, Absalom lived in the capital without entering the king's presence. The partial restoration intensified rather than healed the wound. Absalom had been brought near enough to see the palace, but not near enough to be received by his father. When Joab refused to meet him, Absalom ordered his servants to set Joab's field on fire. Joab finally came. Absalom demanded either full access to the king or judgment for his crime. He refused to remain in a state of unresolved rejection. David summoned him. Absalom bowed before the king. David kissed him. The gesture looked like reconciliation, but the deeper issues had not been confronted. Tamar's violation, Amnon's murder, David's inaction, Absalom's exile, and years of resentment remained beneath the surface. Absalom began building public support. He acquired a chariot, horses, and 50 men to run before him. He positioned himself near the city gate, where legal disputes were heard. When people came seeking judgment from the king, Absalom spoke sympathetically. He told them their claims were good, but no representative of the king was available to hear them. Then he added that if only he were appointed judge, everyone would receive justice. When a person bowed before him, Absalom extended his hand, embraced him, and kissed him. He stole the hearts of the people of Israel. The rebellion did not begin with an army. It began with dissatisfaction at the gates of Jerusalem. Absalom eventually requested permission to go to Hebron, claiming that he needed to fulfill a vow. Hebron was the city where David had first been crowned over Judah. From there, Absalom launched his conspiracy. Messengers were sent throughout the tribes. When the trumpet sounded, they were to proclaim Absalom king. The conspiracy grew strong. Even Ahithophel, one of David's trusted counselors, joined him. A messenger came to David with devastating news. The hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. David immediately ordered his household to flee Jerusalem. The king who had conquered the city now left it to avoid being trapped and to spare the population from battle. His servants remained loyal. David's bodyguard, foreign warriors, and faithful followers crossed out of the city. Ittai the Gittite had only recently come to David, and the king urged him to stay behind rather than share the uncertainty of exile. Ittai refused. Wherever the king went, whether in life or death, he would follow. The people wept as David crossed the Kidron Valley and climbed the Mount of Olives barefoot with his head covered. Years earlier, David had fled Saul. Now he fled his own son. Priests brought the ark, but David ordered them to return it to Jerusalem. He would not use the sacred object as a guarantee of political survival. If he found favor, he would see it again. If not, he was prepared for God's judgment. David learned that Ahithophel had joined the conspiracy. He prayed that the counselor's advice would be turned into foolishness. Then Hushai, David's friend, met him with torn clothing and dust on his head. David sent him back to Jerusalem to act as a counterweight to Ahithophel and to pass information through the priests. As David continued, Ziba met him with supplies and claimed that Mephibosheth had remained behind, hoping Saul's kingdom would be restored. David, under pressure and without investigation, granted Mephibosheth's property to Ziba. Soon afterward, Shimei, a relative of Saul, came out cursing. He threw stones at David and accused him of bloodshed against Saul's house. Abishai wanted to kill him. David refused. Perhaps David said the Lord had allowed the curse. At a moment when his own son sought his life, he would not answer every insult with violence. In Jerusalem, Absalom entered the capital without resistance. Ahithophel advised him to sleep publicly with David's concubines, making reconciliation impossible and demonstrating that he had taken possession of the royal household. A tent was erected on the palace roof. The place from which David had first seen Bathsheba now became the location of his public humiliation. Nathan's warning was being fulfilled. Ahithophel then proposed an immediate attack. He wanted to pursue David that very night with a selected force strike while the king was exhausted, kill David alone, and bring the people back to Absalom. The plan was strategically sound. Hushai argued against it. David and his men were experienced warriors, he said, fierce like a bear robbed of her cubs. If Absalom's forces suffered an early defeat, courage would collapse. Instead, all Israel should be gathered into a massive army, and Absalom himself should lead it. The proposal appealed to Absalom's pride. He rejected Ahithophel's counsel and chose Hushai's. The delay gave David time to cross the Jordan and organize his forces. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he understood that Absalom's rebellion would fail. He returned home, arranged his affairs, and took his own life. David reached Mahanaim, the region from which Ishbosheth had once ruled during the civil war. Supporters brought beds, food, grain, honey, sheep, and other supplies for the exhausted people. Absalom crossed the Jordan with Israel's army. David divided his forces under Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. He wanted to go into battle, but the soldiers refused. David's life was worth more than thousands of them. He remained at the city while the army marched out. Before everyone, David commanded the leaders to deal gently with Absalom for his sake. The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. David's experienced soldiers defeated Absalom's army. The terrain itself consumed more men than the sword. Absalom encountered David's troops while riding a mule. His head became caught in the branches of a large tree, and the mule continued beneath him. He was left suspended between earth and sky. A soldier saw him, but refused to kill him because he had heard David's command. Joab did not hesitate. He thrust weapons into Absalom, and Joab's armor-bearers completed the killing. They threw his body into a pit and covered it with stones. The man who had erected a monument because he feared his name would be forgotten was buried beneath a heap in the forest. When news reached David, the king did not celebrate the victory. He went to the room above the gate and wept. "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom! If only I had died instead of you!" His grief spread through the army. The soldiers entered the city quietly, as though they had been defeated. Joab confronted David. The men who had saved his life, his family, and his kingdom were being made to feel ashamed because the king appeared to love those who hated him more than those who had remained loyal. David returned to the gate and took his public place. But the kingdom was not immediately healed. The tribes debated whether to bring him back. Judah hesitated. Old divisions resurfaced. David sent messages to the elders of Judah, asking why they should be the last to restore him. The tribe gathered behind him. David crossed the Jordan and began the journey back to Jerusalem. Shimei hurried to meet him and begged forgiveness. Abishai again demanded his death. David spared him. Mephibosheth also came. He had not cared for his feet, beard, or clothing since David left signs of mourning that challenged Ziba's accusation. Mephibosheth explained that Ziba had deceived him and left him behind. David divided the land between them, an ambiguous decision that showed the limitations of judgment made during crisis. Barzillai, an elderly man who had supported David during exile, accompanied the king to the Jordan. David offered him a place in Jerusalem, but Barzillai declined because of his age. He asked that another man receive the royal favor in his place. The king crossed back into the land. But tension between Israel and Judah immediately erupted. The northern tribes accused Judah of taking control of David's return. Judah responded defensively. A Benjaminite named Sheba declared that Israel had no share in David and called the tribes away. The United Kingdom nearly fractured again. Joab pursued Sheba to the city of Abel-Beth-Maacah. A wise woman negotiated with him, and the city executed Sheba to avoid destruction. The rebellion ended. David returned to Jerusalem. His throne had survived. Absalom was dead. The conspiracy had failed, yet the kingdom was not the same. The sword had entered David's household just as Nathan had warned. One son had violated his sister. Another had murdered him. The king's inaction had allowed resentment to grow into rebellion. A trusted counselor had betrayed him. The capital had been taken without battle. The tribes had nearly divided. David had returned to Jerusalem, but he could not return to the innocence of his earlier reign. The promise to his house remained. So did the consequences of his choices. And now, as David grew older, another question moved quietly through the palace. Which of his sons would inherit the throne? Which of David's sons would inherit the throne? The question had been growing inside the royal household for years. David had many sons by different wives. Amnon, his firstborn, was dead. Absalom, once admired throughout Israel, had died in rebellion. Another son, Chileab, had disappeared from the biblical narrative. Now David was old. The warrior who had escaped Saul conquered Jerusalem, defeated the Philistines, and survived Absalom's revolt, could no longer lead as he once had. His servants struggled to keep him warm. The palace remained filled with officials, commanders, priests, royal sons, and competing loyalties. The succession had not been publicly settled. Into that uncertainty stepped Adonijah. Adonijah was one of David's oldest surviving sons. Like Absalom before him, he was described as physically impressive. He began presenting himself as the natural heir. "I will be king," he declared. He acquired chariots, horses, and 50 men to run before him. The image was familiar. Absalom had used the same royal display while stealing the hearts of Israel. Now another son of David surrounded himself with the symbols of kingship before receiving the authority of the king. The text adds a painful detail. David had never disciplined Adonijah by asking why he behaved as he did. Once again, the king, who had administered justice throughout the nation, failed to establish clarity within his own household. Adonijah gathered powerful supporters. Joab, David's longtime military commander, joined him. Joab had served David through war, exile, civil conflict, and rebellion. But he had also killed Abner, Amasa, and Absalom against David's wishes. Perhaps he believed Adonijah would protect his position after David's death. Abiathar the priest also supported Adonijah. But Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah son of Jehoiada, David's mighty warriors, and Solomon were not invited into the conspiracy. Adonijah held a great sacrificial feast near the spring of Enrogel. He invited the king's sons, royal officials, and the men of Judah who supported him. The gathering looked like the beginning of a coronation. Nathan understood the danger. He went to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and warned her that Adonijah had declared himself king without David's knowledge. If the plan succeeded, Bathsheba and Solomon could be treated as enemies of the new regime. Nathan urged her to approach David and remind him of his promise that Solomon would succeed him. Bathsheba entered the king's chamber. She bowed and asked why Adonijah was acting as king while David was still alive. She reminded him that all Israel was waiting to learn who would sit on the throne after him. If David died without making his will clear, she and Solomon would be left vulnerable. While she was still speaking, Nathan entered. The prophet asked whether David had secretly appointed Adonijah. He described the feast, the sacrifices, and the supporters gathered around David's son. He also emphasized those who had been excluded. David finally acted. He summoned Bathsheba again and swore that Solomon would become king that very day. Zadok, Nathan, and Benaiah were ordered to place Solomon on David's own mule and lead him to the Gihon spring. There, Zadok and Nathan would anoint him.
Trumpets would sound, and the people would proclaim, "Long live King Solomon."
The procession moved through Jerusalem. Solomon rode the royal mule. At Gihon, Zadok took oil from the sacred tent and anointed him. The trumpets sounded, the people shouted, music filled the city, and the celebration became so loud that the ground seemed to shake. At En-Rogel, Adonijah's feast was ending. Joab heard the trumpet. A messenger arrived and announced that David had made Solomon king. Royal officials had blessed him. Solomon had taken his place on the throne, and David had bowed in worship from his bed. Fear swept through Adonijah's guests. The gathering scattered. The men who had celebrated him as king moments earlier now returned to their homes. Adonijah fled to the altar and took hold of its horns, seeking protection. He begged for Solomon to swear that he would not execute him. Solomon did not immediately order his death. He said that if Adonijah proved himself honorable, he would be safe. But if wickedness was found in him, he would die. Adonijah came and bowed before Solomon. The new king sent him home. The first crisis had ended without bloodshed, but the struggle for the throne was not truly over. David's final days were approaching. Before his death, he charged Solomon to be strong and to walk faithfully before the Lord. He reminded his son that royal success was not ultimately secured by armies, wealth, or inheritance. The king was to obey the law given through Moses. David also gave Solomon instructions concerning unfinished political dangers. Joab's bloodshed could not remain unanswered forever. The sons of Barzillai, who had supported David during Absalom's rebellion, were to receive kindness. Shimei, who had cursed David during the flight from Jerusalem, required careful judgment. David died after ruling Israel for 40 years. He had taken a divided and threatened group of tribes and left behind a united kingdom with Jerusalem as its capital. He had established military security, organized national leadership, brought the ark into the city, prepared for the temple, and received the promise of a continuing dynasty. But he also left unresolved wounds. The consequences of his sins had torn through his family. Several sons were dead. Joab remained dangerous. The royal household contained rival loyalties. Solomon inherited not only a throne, but a kingdom that still required consolidation. Adonijah soon approached Bathsheba with another request. He acknowledged that he had once expected the kingdom to be his, but he now claimed to accept that it had passed to Solomon. Then he asked Bathsheba to request Abishag the Shunammite as his wife. Abishag had cared for David in his old age. Though the text states that David had not been intimate with her, she belonged to the late king's household. In the political culture of the time, taking a former king's woman could signal a claim to royal authority. Bathsheba brought the request to Solomon. The king immediately recognized its meaning. He asked why Adonijah did not simply request the kingdom as well, since he had Abiathar and Joab behind him. Solomon ordered Benaiah to execute Adonijah. The son who had declared himself king was dead. Abiathar was removed from the priesthood and sent to his home. Solomon spared his life because he had carried the ark and suffered alongside David, but his political influence ended. When Joab heard what had happened, he fled to the altar and took hold of its horns. Benaiah ordered him to come out. Joab refused. He chose to die there. Solomon commanded that the sentence be carried out. Joab was killed, and Benaiah replaced him as commander of the army. Zadok took Abiathar's place as priest. Shimei was confined to Jerusalem under oath. Solomon warned him that if he crossed the Kidron Valley, he would die. For 3 years, Shimei obeyed. Then 2 of his servants escaped, and he left the city to recover them. When he returned, Solomon confronted him for breaking the oath. Shimei was executed. The kingdom was now firmly established in Solomon's hands. The consolidation was severe, but it removed the most immediate threats surrounding the transition. The long years of rivalry within David's household had ended with Solomon on the throne. Yet the greatness of Solomon's reign would not be remembered primarily for political purges. It would be remembered for wisdom. Early in his reign, Solomon traveled to Gibeon, where the principal high place stood before the temple had been built. He offered sacrifices there. That night, God appeared to him in a dream. "Ask what I shall give you." Solomon could have asked for long life, wealth, military strength, or the death of his enemies. Instead, he spoke of the responsibility placed before him. He called himself inexperienced and recognized that he was ruling a great people. He asked for an understanding heart to judge them and distinguish between right and wrong. The request pleased God. Because Solomon had not asked for selfish gain, he received wisdom. He was also promised riches and honor beyond the kings of his generation. A long life was possible if he walked faithfully as David had been commanded to walk. The promise was generous, but it was also conditional. Solomon returned to Jerusalem, stood before the Ark of the Covenant, offered sacrifices, and held a feast for his servants. Soon his wisdom was tested. 2 women came before him with a child. Both lived in the same house. Each had given birth. One infant had died during the night. The surviving child was claimed by both women. There were no witnesses. Each accused the other of exchanging the babies. Solomon called for a sword. He ordered that the living child be divided and half given to each woman. The true mother immediately begged the king to give the child to the other woman rather than kill him. The other agreed to the division. Solomon gave the child to the woman who had shown compassion. Israel heard of the judgment and stood in awe. They saw that the king possessed wisdom to administer justice. Solomon organized the kingdom into administrative districts. Officials supervised taxation, supplies, military resources, and the royal household. Each district provided food for the palace during an assigned month. The system demonstrated order and efficiency. It also revealed the growing demands of the monarchy. The royal court was vast. The number of people, animals, officers, servants, and military units supported by the kingdom had expanded far beyond anything Israel had known under the judges. For a time, the nation prospered. Judah and Israel were described as numerous, eating, drinking, and living securely. Solomon's influence stretched from the Euphrates region toward Egypt. Neighboring rulers brought tribute. His wisdom became famous. He spoke thousands of proverbs and composed songs. He discussed plants, animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. People from many nations came to hear him. The kingdom had moved from Saul's fragile beginnings to international recognition. But Solomon's greatest project was still ahead. David had desired to build a house for the Lord, but had been told that his son would complete the work. Solomon now turned to the temple. He contacted Hiram, king of Tyre, who had been friendly with David. Solomon explained that David had been unable to build because of constant warfare. Now, with enemies subdued and rest on every side, the time had come. Hiram supplied cedar and cypress timber from Lebanon. Israel provided food for his royal household. Skilled workers cut and transported the wood. Solomon also raised a labor force from Israel. Tens of thousands were assigned to work in shifts in Lebanon. Others carried loads or cut stone in the hill country. Supervisors managed the projects. The temple would become the spiritual center of the kingdom, but its construction depended upon an expanding system of royal labor. The building rose on Mount Moriah, at the site associated in Chronicles with the threshing floor David had purchased after the plague that followed his census. Near the end of David's reign, the king had ordered the fighting men of Israel counted. Joab had objected, recognizing danger in the command, but David insisted. The act appears to have reflected wrongful reliance on military strength or royal pride. Judgment followed. David chose to fall into the hands of God rather than human enemies, and a plague struck the nation. When the destroying angel approached Jerusalem, the Lord restrained the judgment. David saw the angel near the threshing floor of Araunah, also called Ornan. He confessed that he had sinned and asked that judgment fall upon him and his household rather than the people. David purchased the site, built an altar, and offered sacrifices. That place became connected with the future temple. The location that had witnessed judgment, mercy, sacrifice, and the halting of death now became the place where Solomon built the house of the Lord. The construction took 7 years. Massive stones formed the structure. Cedar lined the interior. Carvings of flowers, palm trees, and cherubim covered the walls. Gold was used throughout the sacred spaces. The most holy place contained 2 great cherubim stretching their wings across the room. The ark would rest beneath them. Outside stood bronze pillars, basins, carts, and a great basin known as the sea. Skilled craftsmen shaped the temple furnishings. The design was filled with symbolic beauty, but the purpose of the building was not to contain God as though he were limited to a house. It was to provide a central place for covenant worship. When the work was complete, Solomon gathered Israel's elders and tribal leaders. The priests carried the ark from the city of David into the temple. Sacrifices were offered in such number that they could not be counted. The ark was placed in the most holy place. Inside it were the tablets of the covenant. When the priests withdrew, a cloud filled the temple. They could not continue ministering because the glory of the Lord filled the house. Solomon turned toward the assembly. He blessed the people and declared that God had fulfilled the promise given to David. David had desired to build, but Solomon had completed the work and placed the ark there. Then Solomon stood before the altar, spread out his hands toward heaven, and prayed. He acknowledged that no God could compare with the Lord, who kept covenant with those who walked faithfully. He asked that the promise to David continue. Yet Solomon also recognized the limitation of the temple. Even the highest heavens could not contain God. How much less could a building made by human hands contain him? The temple mattered, not because God was confined within its walls, but because he had chosen to place his name there and hear prayers directed toward it. Solomon prayed for justice when disputes arose. He prayed for mercy when Israel was defeated because of sin. He prayed for rain when drought came. He prayed during famine, plagues, siege, and disaster. He prayed for the foreigner who would come because of God's great name. He prayed for the army when it went to battle. Most significantly, he prayed for the future possibility of exile. If Israel's sin was defeated and carried into a distant land, Solomon asked that God hear them when they repented and turned toward the land, the city, and the temple. At At the dedication of the most glorious building in Israel's history, the king already acknowledged that disobedience could lead to removal from the land. The warning of exile stood inside the prayer of dedication. After Solomon finished, fire came down and consumed the sacrifices, according to Chronicles. The glory filled the temple. The people bowed and worshipped. A great feast followed. For 7 days, Israel celebrated the dedication, and the festival continued with extraordinary joy. The people returned home, grateful for the goodness shown to David, Solomon, and Israel. The kingdom appeared to have reached its spiritual and political summit. Jerusalem was secure. The temple was complete. The dynasty was established. The nation was prosperous. Foreign powers respected Solomon. But the dedication contained a warning Solomon himself would later fail to obey. God appeared to him again. The temple had been accepted as a place of prayer and sacrifice. But if Solomon and his descendants turned away, served other gods, and abandoned the covenant, Israel would be removed from the land. The temple would not protect a rebellious people merely because it stood in Jerusalem. A sacred building could become a ruin. A nation celebrated for wisdom could become an object of astonishment. The promise and warning stood together. Solomon continued building. His own palace complex took 13 years, nearly twice as long as the temple. It included the House of the Forest of Lebanon, a hall of pillars, a throne hall, royal residences, and a separate house for Pharaoh's daughter. The buildings displayed extraordinary wealth and power. Solomon developed fortified cities, storage centers, chariot cities, and military infrastructure. He expanded trade. Ships traveled from ports near the Red Sea. Gold, precious stones, exotic goods, and rare animals arrived from distant regions. His fame spread. The Queen of Sheba came to test him with difficult questions. She arrived with a great caravan carrying spices, gold, and precious stones. Solomon answered everything. She saw his wisdom, palace, officials, servants, food, worship, and the order of his court. She was overwhelmed. She praised the God of Israel for placing Solomon on the throne to establish justice and righteousness. The scene showed the international influence Israel had achieved. A foreign queen recognized the blessing surrounding the king. But the abundance also revealed how far the monarchy had moved from Samuel's first warning. Gold arrived in enormous quantities. Silver became so common in Jerusalem that it was treated as ordinary. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses, many connected to Egypt and neighboring markets. The law in Deuteronomy had warned Israel's king not to multiply horses, wives, or excessive wealth. Solomon multiplied all three. His political marriages joined him to royal families throughout the region. Such alliances could secure peace and trade, but they also brought foreign worship into the heart of Jerusalem. Solomon loved many foreign women. He married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and other nations. The concern was not their ethnicity alone. Ruth had been a Moabite and had become part of David's ancestry through faithfulness to Israel's God. The danger was that Solomon's wives continued serving other gods and turned his heart toward their worship. As Solomon grew old, his heart was no longer fully devoted to the Lord. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He built high places for Chemosh and Molech on hills near Jerusalem. The king who had built the temple also built altars to foreign gods. The man who had prayed that foreigners would come to worship Israel's God began supporting worship that led Israel away from him. Solomon did not abandon every form of devotion to the Lord. That made the compromise more dangerous. The temple still stood. Sacrifices still continued. The royal administration still functioned. The kingdom still appeared wealthy. But the heart of the king was divided. God became angry with Solomon because he had turned away despite receiving repeated revelation. The kingdom would be torn from his house. Yet because of David, the division would not occur during Solomon's lifetime.
His son would retain one tribe and Jerusalem for the sake of the Davidic promise. The United Kingdom had reached its highest visible glory. Its fracture had already been announced. Adversaries began rising. Hadad the Edomite opposed Solomon from the south. Rezon became an enemy from Damascus. Resistance grew within the kingdom itself. Among Solomon's officials was Jeroboam, an industrious man from the tribe of Ephraim. Solomon recognized his ability and placed him over labor forces from the house of Joseph. One day, the prophet Ahijah met Jeroboam outside Jerusalem. Ahijah wore a new cloak. He tore it into 12 pieces and told Jeroboam to take 10. The action symbolized what was coming. God would tear the kingdom from Solomon's house and give 10 tribes to Jeroboam. One portion would remain with David's line because of Jerusalem and the covenant promise. Jeroboam was offered an extraordinary opportunity. If he listened, obeyed, and walked faithfully, God would build him an enduring house. The northern kingdom did not have to begin in rebellion against God. Its future ruler was given a conditional promise similar in principle to the one Israel's kings had always received: authority must remain under obedience. When Solomon learned of the threat, he tried to kill Jeroboam. Jeroboam fled to Egypt and remained there until Solomon's death. The king who had begun his reign asking for wisdom ended it trying to preserve a kingdom that God had already declared would be divided. Solomon died after ruling for 40 years. His son Rehoboam succeeded him. The royal transition seemed orderly, but beneath it lay decades of forced labor, taxation, regional resentment, and the memory of Solomon's expanding court. The tribes gathered at Shechem to make Rehoboam king. Shechem was located in the north, in the territory of Ephraim. The location itself revealed that the northern tribes expected negotiation. They were not simply traveling to Jerusalem to accept whatever the king commanded. Jeroboam returned from Egypt. He and the assembly approached Rehoboam with a request. "Your father made our yoke heavy." They did not deny Solomon's achievements. They did not demand the abolition of monarchy. They asked for relief from harsh labor and heavy burdens. If Rehoboam lightened the load, they promised to serve him. The new king asked for 3 days to consider the matter. He first consulted the elders who had served Solomon. They understood the moment. If Rehoboam became a servant to the people, answered them kindly, and reduced the burden, the tribes would remain loyal. The advice presented kingship as service. A ruler could preserve unity by listening. Rehoboam rejected their counsel. He turned to the younger men who had grown up with him at court. They advised him to answer with intimidation. He should declare that his little finger was thicker than his father's waist. Solomon had placed a heavy yoke upon them. Rehoboam would make it heavier. Solomon had disciplined them with whips. Rehoboam would discipline them with scorpions. On the 3rd day, Jeroboam and the people returned. Rehoboam spoke harshly. He rejected the wisdom of the elders and repeated the words of the younger men. The response transformed discontent into rebellion. The northern tribes asked what share they had in David and what inheritance they possessed in Jesse's son. "To your tents, Israel!" The cry that had nearly divided the nation during David's reign now became permanent. The tribes departed. Rehoboam sent Adoniram, the official in charge of forced labor, perhaps hoping to reassert royal authority. The people stoned him to death. Rehoboam barely escaped in his chariot and fled to Jerusalem. The United Kingdom was over. Israel had not fallen to a foreign army. It had been divided by accumulated compromise, oppressive administration, royal pride, and a king who refused to listen.
Rehoboam gathered the forces of Judah and Benjamin to fight the northern tribes and restore the kingdom. But the prophet Shemaiah delivered the word of God. They were not to fight their brothers. The division had come under divine judgment. The army returned home. In the north, the people made Jeroboam king. In the south, Rehoboam continued ruling from Jerusalem. From this point forward, the name Israel would usually refer to the northern kingdom, while Judah would refer to the southern kingdom, centered on Jerusalem and the house of David. One nation had become two. Israel possessed more tribes, more territory, and some of the land's richest agricultural regions. Judah possessed Jerusalem, the temple, and the Davidic dynasty. But neither geography nor ancestry could guarantee faithfulness. The northern kingdom was about to build a new religious system out of political fear, and the southern kingdom was about to discover that possessing the temple did not mean it could ignore the God worshipped there. One nation had become two. In the south, Rehoboam ruled Judah from Jerusalem. He possessed the temple, the capital established by David, and the royal line that carried God's covenant promise. In the north, Jeroboam ruled a larger territory called Israel. He controlled most of the tribe's fertile valleys, important trade routes, and cities capable of supporting a powerful kingdom. Both kings had inherited an opportunity. Both had also inherited fear. Rehoboam feared losing authority over the people who remained under him. Jeroboam feared that the people he had gained would eventually return to the house of David. That fear shaped the northern kingdom from its beginning. Jeroboam had received a remarkable promise through the prophet Ahijah. If he obeyed God and walked faithfully, his dynasty could be established. He did not need to create a new religion to preserve his throne. His authority had been permitted under divine judgment against Solomon's house. But Jeroboam looked south toward Jerusalem. The temple stood there. The priests served there. The great festivals of Israel's covenant were centered there. If the people of the northern tribes continued traveling to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices, Jeroboam feared that their loyalty would return to Rehoboam. He reasoned that worship in Jerusalem would become political reconciliation. Then the people would kill him and reunite the kingdom under David's house. Jeroboam faced a choice between trusting the promise he had received and securing his throne through his own design. He chose control. The king made 2 golden calves. He placed one at Bethel in the southern part of his kingdom and the other at Dan in the far north. He told the people that traveling to Jerusalem was too difficult and presented these images as the gods who had brought Israel out of Egypt. The words deliberately echoed one of the darkest moments in Israel's wilderness history. While Moses had been receiving the covenant on Mount Sinai, Aaron had made a golden calf, and the people had associated it with the God who delivered them from Egypt. Now Jeroboam turned that ancient rebellion into national policy. The new worship system was politically convenient. People no longer needed to cross into Judah. Northern Israel now possessed its own sanctuaries, priest's altar, and festival calendar. Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests who were not from the tribe of Levi. He established a festival resembling the celebration held in Judah, but placed it on a date of his own choosing. This was not merely private unbelief, it was the institutionalization of compromise. Future northern kings would be measured against what the books of Kings repeatedly call the sin of Jeroboam son of Nebat, which he caused Israel to commit. Even rulers who destroyed rival dynasties or removed other forms of idolatry often left Jeroboam's system untouched. The calves became symbols of a kingdom attempting to preserve itself without trusting the God who had allowed it to exist. Jeroboam stood at the altar in Bethel to burn incense. During the ceremony, an unnamed man of God arrived from Judah and cried out against the altar. He declared that a future descendant of David named Josiah would defile it by burning the bones of its priests upon it. The prophecy reached far beyond Jeroboam's generation. As a sign, the altar split apart and its ashes poured out. Jeroboam stretched out his hand and ordered the prophet seized. His hand became unable to move. The king who had built the altar could not command his own body. He asked the man of God to pray for him. The prophet did, and Jeroboam's hand was restored. Yet even after this warning, Jeroboam did not turn away from his system. A personal experience of judgment and mercy did not lead to national repentance. Later, Jeroboam's son Abijah became sick. The king sent his wife in disguise to consult Ahijah, the same prophet who had once announced that Jeroboam would rule Israel. Age had dimmed the prophet's physical sight, but the disguise could not hide the truth. Before she entered, Ahijah knew who she was. He delivered a message of judgment. Jeroboam had been raised from among the people and given authority, yet he had acted more wickedly than those before him. He had made other gods and turned his back on the one who appointed him. His dynasty would be swept away. The sick child would die, and the house of Jeroboam would be destroyed. The child was the only member of the royal house in whom something pleasing to the Lord was found. His death was therefore described not simply as punishment, but as removal before the coming disaster. When Jeroboam's wife returned home, the boy died as she crossed the threshold. Jeroboam continued ruling for years, but the future of his dynasty had already been spoken. In Judah, Rehoboam possessed the temple, but did not remain faithful merely because he lived near it. During his reign, Judah also practiced idolatry. High places, sacred pillars, and pagan symbols appeared throughout the land. The sins associated with the nations Israel had displaced returned within the territory centered on Jerusalem. In the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign, Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt invaded. He attacked fortified cities and advanced toward Jerusalem. The king and Judah's leaders humbled themselves when the prophet Shemaiah announced that the invasion was connected to their abandonment of the Lord. Jerusalem was not destroyed, but Shishak took treasures from the temple and the royal palace, including the gold shield Solomon had made. Rehoboam replaced them with bronze shields. The change was more than a detail of palace decoration. Under Solomon, gold had symbolized extraordinary abundance. Under Rehoboam, bronze imitated what had been lost. The royal processions continued. Guards still carried shields. The palace still displayed power, but the glory was thinner than it had been. The kingdom could preserve the appearance of Solomon's age without possessing its reality. After Rehoboam came Abijah, also called Abijam. Conflict with the northern kingdom continued. The division had become a permanent political and military rivalry. Then Asa became king of Judah. Asa brought meaningful reform. He removed many pagan altars, commanded Judah to seek the Lord, and even removed his grandmother Maacah from her powerful position because she had made an idolatrous image. For much of his reign, Judah experienced stability. But Asa's faith was not without failure. When Baasha, king of Israel, fortified Ramah to control movement near Judah, Asa took silver and gold from the temple and palace treasuries. He sent them to Ben-Hadad of Damascus, asking the Aramean king to break his treaty with Israel. The strategy worked politically. Ben-Hadad attacked northern territories, forcing Baasha to abandon Ramah. Judah used the abandoned materials to strengthen its own cities. Yet the prophet Hanani confronted Asa. The king had relied on Aram rather than on the Lord. Earlier, Asa had trusted God against a larger army, but now he treated foreign alliance and sacred treasure as his primary security. Asa became angry and imprisoned the prophet. In his later years, even a king remembered for reform showed how fear could narrow faith. The northern kingdom, meanwhile, entered a pattern of instability. Jeroboam's son Nadab succeeded him, but ruled only briefly. Baasha assassinated him and destroyed Jeroboam's entire household, fulfilling the judgment spoken through Ahijah. But Baasha did not reject Jeroboam's religious system. He repeated the same pattern. A new dynasty occupied the throne, but the kingdom's direction remained unchanged. The prophet Jehu, son of Hanani, announced judgment against Baasha's house. Baasha had been raised from obscurity, yet he had walked in Jeroboam's way and caused Israel to sin. His son Elah was assassinated by Zimri, one of his military commanders. Zimri then killed Baasha's descendants and friends. His reign lasted only 7 days. When the army heard what had happened, it proclaimed its commander Omri king. Omri marched against Tirzah, the capital. Zimri saw that the city had fallen and set the royal palace on fire around himself. Another dynasty ended in flames. The kingdom divided again between supporters of Omri and supporters of a rival named Tibni. Omri eventually prevailed. He purchased a hill and built a new capital upon it. The city was named Samaria. Its elevated position made it defensible, and it would become the political center of northern Israel for the remainder of the kingdom's history. Omri was an important ruler by political standards. His dynasty gained international recognition, strengthened Israel's position, and created alliances that increased wealth and influence. But the biblical account evaluates him by a different standard. He did more evil than the kings before him. Political strength did not cancel covenant unfaithfulness. Omri's son Ahab inherited the throne. Under Ahab, Israel became militarily significant and economically powerful. But spiritually, the kingdom moved into deeper conflict. Ahab married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. The marriage connected Israel with the prosperous Phoenician cities of the Mediterranean coast. It also brought official support for Baal worship into the royal court. Baal was associated with storms, fertility, rain, and agricultural abundance. In a land dependent upon seasonal rainfall, the worship of such a deity offered both religious attraction and political advantage. Ahab built a temple and altar for Baal in Samaria. Jezebel supported hundreds of prophets connected to Baal and Asherah. She also persecuted the prophets of the Lord. Israel was no longer merely combining unauthorized images with worship associated with the Exodus. The royal house was now sponsoring an organized rival cult. Into this conflict stepped Elijah. The prophet appeared suddenly before Ahab with a declaration aimed directly at Baal's supposed power. There would be neither dew nor rain except by Elijah's word. The skies closed, the land dried, fields failed, streams shrank. The drought became a public contest over who truly commanded rain and life. Elijah withdrew to the brook Cherith, where he was sustained until the water disappeared. Then he was sent beyond Israel's borders to Zarephath in the region of Sidon, the homeland associated with Jezebel's religion. There a widow was gathering sticks for what she believed would be a final meal for herself and her son. Her flour and oil were nearly gone. Elijah asked for food and promised that the flour jar would not be exhausted and the oil jug would not run dry until rain returned. The widow acted in faith. She and her household survived. When her son later became ill and died, Elijah carried him to an upper room and cried out to God. The child's life returned. In the territory identified with Baal, the god of Israel, provided food and restored life. After years of drought, Elijah returned to confront Ahab. The king accused him of troubling Israel. Elijah reversed the charge. The true trouble had come from Ahab's abandonment of God's commands and pursuit of the Baals. Elijah called for Israel to gather at Mount Carmel along with the prophets supported by Jezebel. Before the assembled people, Elijah asked a question that exposed the nation's divided loyalty. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord was God, they should follow him. If Baal was God, they should follow Baal. The people gave no answer. 2 sacrifices were prepared. The prophets of Baal called upon their God from morning until midday. They danced around the altar, they shouted, they cut themselves until blood flowed. There was no voice, no answer, no fire. Elijah repaired an altar of the Lord using 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel. The kingdom had divided, but the covenant identity of the 12 tribes had not been forgotten. He arranged the sacrifice and poured water over it until the trench surrounding the altar was filled. Then he prayed. He did not perform for hours. He asked that Israel know the Lord was God and that their hearts might be turned back. Fire fell. It consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and the water. The people fell on their faces. The Lord, He is God. The prophets of Baal were seized and killed.
Soon afterward, clouds appeared over the sea. Rain returned. The contest at Carmel was decisive, but it did not immediately transform the royal house. When Jezebel learned what Elijah had done, she threatened to kill him. The prophet who had stood alone before hundreds now fled into the wilderness. Exhausted and afraid, he asked to die. God met him not with condemnation, but with food rest and direction. Elijah traveled to Horeb, the mountain associated with the covenant given through Moses. There he experienced wind, earthquake, and fire, but the divine message came in a quiet, gentle manner. Elijah believed he alone remained faithful. God corrected him. There were still thousands in Israel who had not bowed to Baal. The prophet was given new assignments. He was to anoint future agents of judgment, including Hazael over Aram, Jehu over Israel, and Elisha as his prophetic successor. The work was larger than one dramatic victory. Carmel had revealed the truth, but Israel's rebellion would require years of warning, conflict, and judgment. Ahab's reign also exposed the connection between idolatry and injustice. Near the royal palace in Jezreel was a vineyard belonging to Naboth. Ahab wanted the land for a vegetable garden and offered to purchase it or exchange it for a better vineyard. Naboth refused because the property was part of his ancestral inheritance. His answer was rooted in Israel's covenant understanding of land. The king could not simply treat every field as royal property. Ahab returned home resentful. He lay on his bed, turned his face away, and refused to eat. Jezebel asked why he was so troubled. When he explained, she responded with the assumptions of absolute monarchy. Was he not the king of Israel? She would obtain the vineyard for him. Jezebel wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his authority. The elders of Naboth's city were instructed to arrange false accusations of blasphemy and treason. Naboth was taken outside the city and stoned to death. When Jezebel told Ahab that Naboth was dead, the king went to take possession of the vineyard. Elijah met him there. The prophet announced judgment against Ahab's house. Dogs would lick his blood. Jezebel would die near the wall of Jezreel. The dynasty would be swept away. Ahab called Elijah his enemy, but the prophet had not created the king's guilt. He had exposed it. Ahab had sold himself to evil influenced by Jezebel, and had used royal power to take what the law did not allow him to possess. When Ahab heard the judgment, he tore his clothes, fasted, and humbled himself. Because of that humility, the complete disaster upon his house was delayed until the days of his son. Even in one of Israel's darkest reigns, judgment was not portrayed as mechanical or without response. Humility still mattered. Yet Ahab's political ambitions continued. For 3 years, Israel and Aram remained without war. Then Ahab decided to recover Ramoth-Gilead,
Jehoshaphat, king of Judah and son of Asa, had entered an alliance with Ahab's house. Jehoshaphat had pursued reform in Judah and sent teachers through the land to instruct the people in the law. But his alliance with Ahab brought him into dangerous compromise. Ahab asked whether Judah would join the campaign. Jehoshaphat agreed, but requested that they first seek the word of the Lord. Hundreds of prophets promised victory. One prophet, Zedekiah son of Chenaanah, made iron horns and declared that Ahab would gore the Arameans with them. Jehoshaphat sensed that something was missing. Is there not another prophet of the Lord here? Ahab admitted that there was one more, Micaiah son of Imlah. But Ahab hated him because he never prophesied anything favorable. Micaiah was summoned. The messenger urged him to agree with the others. Micaiah refused to promise anything except what God gave him to say. When he appeared, he initially repeated the prediction of success in a tone that led Ahab to demand the truth. Then Micaiah described Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep without a shepherd. Ahab would not return safely. Micaiah also described a heavenly scene showing that the confident predictions surrounding the king would lead him into judgment. Zedekiah struck Micaiah. Ahab ordered the prophet imprisoned and fed only bread and water until the king returned in peace. Micaiah answered that if Ahab returned safely, the Lord had not spoken through him. Ahab attempted to avoid the prophecy by entering battle in disguise, while Jehoshaphat wore royal robes. The Aramean commanders were instructed to focus upon the king of Israel. They initially pursued Jehoshaphat, believing him to be Ahab. When he cried out, they realized their mistake and turned away. Then an archer drew his bow without knowing Ahab's identity. The arrow struck the king between sections of his armor. Ahab remained propped in his chariot as the battle continued. Blood flowed into the bottom of the vehicle. By evening, he died. The army scattered. Ahab's chariot was washed near Samaria, and dogs licked his blood, fulfilling Elijah's word. His son Ahaziah succeeded him, but died after a short reign. Another son, Joram, also called Jehoram, took the throne. The house of Ahab remained in power, and its influence had crossed into Judah through marriage. Jehoshaphat's son Jehoram married Athaliah, a daughter of Ahab's royal house. Thus, the compromise of northern Israel entered the Davidic dynasty. After Jehoshaphat's death, Jehoram of Judah killed his own brothers to secure his position. His reign was marked by rebellion, defeat, and judgment. Edom broke away from Judah's control. Enemies attacked Jerusalem and carried away royal possessions and members of the king's household. Jehoram died after severe illness, and his son Ahaziah became king. Ahaziah's mother Athaliah guided him in the ways of Ahab's house. The royal families of Israel and Judah were now tied together by blood politics and shared corruption. While kings formed alliances, Elisha continued the prophetic ministry begun under Elijah. Elijah had called him while he was plowing. Elisha left his former life and became his attendant. When Elijah's ministry reached its end, the two crossed the Jordan together. A chariot and horses of fire appeared, and Elijah was taken away in a whirlwind. Elisha picked up Elijah's fallen mantle and returned across the river. The prophetic mission continued. Elisha's ministry moved through royal courts, military conflicts, villages, and ordinary homes. He provided oil for a widow facing the loss of her sons to creditors. He promised a child to a Shunammite woman and later prayed when that child died, after which the boy's life was restored. He purified poisoned food, fed many from a limited supply, and healed Naaman, commander of the Aramean army, from leprosy. Naaman's healing revealed that Israel's God was not limited by national borders. The foreign commander arrived with wealth and royal connections, expecting a dramatic ritual.
Instead, he was told to wash in the Jordan. At first, his pride resisted the simplicity of the command. When he finally obeyed, he was healed. He confessed that there was no God in all the earth except the God of Israel. But Elisha's servant Gehazi pursued Naaman afterward and lied to obtain payment. The greed of the servant corrupted a moment intended to display grace. The disease from which Naaman had been cleansed came upon Gehazi. Elisha also warned Israel's kings about Aramean military movements. At one point, the king of Aram sent forces to capture him. The city where Elisha stayed was surrounded. Elisha's servant panicked. The prophet prayed that his eyes would be opened. The servant saw the hills filled with horses and chariots of fire. The visible army surrounding them was not the only power present. Yet northern Israel did not become faithful because it repeatedly experienced prophetic rescue. Samaria was later besieged, and famine became so severe that horrifying suffering spread through the city. The king blamed Elisha, but the prophet announced that food would soon become abundant. 4 men with leprosy entered the Aramean camp and discovered it abandoned. God had caused the enemy to hear the sound of a vast army. The Arameans had fled, leaving food and possessions behind. The starving city was delivered. Once again, mercy came to a kingdom that had not earned it. But mercy did not cancel the judgment already announced against Ahab's house. Elisha sent one of the sons of the prophets to Ramoth-Gilead with a flask of oil. There Jehu served as a military commander under King Joram of Israel. The young prophet took Jehu into a private room, poured oil over his head, and declared him king. Jehu was commanded to strike the house of Ahab and bring judgment for the blood of God's servants shed by Jezebel. Then the messenger opened the door and fled. Jehu returned to the other officers. They pressed him to reveal what had happened. When he told them he had been anointed king, they quickly placed their garments beneath him, blew a trumpet, and proclaimed, "Jehu is king." The conspiracy moved immediately. King Joram was recovering at Jezreel from wounds received in battle. Ahaziah, king of Judah, had gone there to visit him. A watchman saw Jehu's company approaching and recognized the furious manner in which he drove. Messengers were sent to ask whether he came in peace. Jehu ordered each to fall in behind him. Finally, Joram and Ahaziah rode out in their chariots. They met Jehu near the property once owned by Naboth. The location brought the story back to the injustice committed under Ahab and Jezebel. Joram asked, "Is it peace, Jehu?" Jehu answered that there could be no peace while Jezebel's idolatry and sorcery continued. Joram turned to flee and cried out that it was treachery. Jehu drew his bow and shot him through the back. Joram collapsed in his chariot. Jehu ordered that his body be thrown into Naboth's field, recalling the judgment spoken after Naboth's murder. Ahaziah of Judah also fled. Jehu's men pursued and wounded him. He died, and the southern kingdom lost a king because of its alliance with Ahab's house. Jehu then entered Jezreel. Jezebel prepared herself and looked down from a window. She addressed him with contempt, comparing him to an earlier royal assassin. Jehu looked up and called for anyone loyal to him to throw her down. Officials pushed her from the window. She died below, and when men later went to bury her, little remained. Elijah's prophecy had been fulfilled. Jehu proceeded to destroy Ahab's descendants and supporters. He used deception to gather the worshippers of Baal into their temple, claiming that he would serve Baal more zealously than Ahab had. Once the building was full, Jehu's soldiers killed those inside. The sacred pillar was destroyed, and the temple was demolished. Official Baal worship sponsored by Ahab's dynasty was removed from Israel.
it appeared that the kingdom had finally experienced a decisive reform. But Jehu did not remove the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. He destroyed the religious system that threatened his revolution, while preserving the system that protected the northern throne.
He rejected Ahab's Baal worship, but continued walking in Jeroboam's sin. The revolution changed the dynasty. It did not fully change the kingdom. Jehu received a promise that his descendants would sit on Israel's throne for 4 generations because he had carried out judgment against Ahab's house. Yet during his reign, Israel began losing territory to Hazael of Aram. The kingdom that had once expanded under Omri and Ahab was being reduced. In Judah, Athaliah learned that her son Ahaziah was dead. She attempted to destroy the remaining royal family and take the throne for herself. For a moment, the line of David appeared to stand at the edge of extinction. But Ahaziah's sister Jehosheba secretly rescued his infant son Joash. She hid him with his nurse inside the temple for 6 years while Athaliah ruled. The northern dynasty of Ahab had nearly consumed the southern house of David. Yet one child survived in hiding. At the proper time, the priest Jehoiada brought Joash forward. Royal guards surrounded him. The crown was placed upon his head, and the people shouted, "Long live the king!" Athaliah heard the celebration and entered the temple area. "Treason! Treason!" she cried. She was taken outside and executed. The covenant with David's house continued through a child whom the palace had failed to destroy. Joash began well. Under the guidance of Jehoiada, he repaired the temple and removed the symbols of Baal worship associated with Athaliah. But after Jehoiada's death, Joash listened to corrupt officials. Judah returned to idolatry. When Zechariah, Jehoiada's son, rebuked the people, Joash ordered him stoned in the temple court. The king, preserved through the courage of Jehoiada's family, later killed a prophet from that same family. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. A dynasty could be replaced, an altar could be destroyed, a reform could begin, a temple could be repaired. Yet unless the heart of the king and the people changed, compromise returned in another form. Israel had survived civil war, assassinations, Aramean invasions, famine, and repeated royal upheaval. Judah had preserved David's line despite rebellion, alliance, and attempted extermination. Both kingdoms still stood. But the prophets had begun speaking with increasing urgency. A greater empire was rising beyond their borders. And before foreign armies destroyed Israel's cities, the kingdom would experience one final season of prosperity, an age in which wealth concealed injustice, worship concealed rebellion, and apparent strength concealed how close the end had come. Israel and Judah still stood. Their borders had changed, their kings had risen and fallen, dynasties in the north had been destroyed by assassination, while the house of David had survived rebellion, foreign influence, and attempted extermination. The prophets had warned them. The people had witnessed drought, famine, military defeat, miraculous rescue, and repeated opportunities to return. Yet both kingdoms remained, and for a time northern Israel appeared to be recovering. After Jehu, his son Jehoahaz ruled Israel during years of severe pressure from Aram. The northern army was reduced until only a small force remained. Cities once protected by strong defenses lived beneath the shadow of Damascus. Jehoahaz sought the Lord, and relief came. The text does not describe Israel's deliverance as proof that the kingdom had become faithful. The people continued the sins established under Jeroboam, but God showed compassion because he remembered his covenant and saw the suffering of Israel under oppression. Mercy delayed destruction. It did not remove the need for repentance. Jehoahaz's son Jehoash, also called Joash, succeeded him. During his reign, the prophet Elisha became terminally ill. The king came to him and wept.
my father," he cried, "the chariots and horsemen of Israel." The words recognized that Israel's true security had never rested only in weapons or armies. The prophetic presence represented something more powerful than military strength. Elisha told the king to take a bow and arrows. He placed his hands upon the king's hands and instructed him to shoot an arrow through the eastern window. The arrow represented victory over Aram. Then Elisha told him to strike the ground with the remaining arrows. The king struck 3 times and stopped. Elisha became angry. Had the king struck 5 or 6 times, he would have defeated Aram completely. Instead, he would win only 3 victories. The moment reflected the limited faith and limited restoration of the age. Israel would recover, but it would not be healed. After Elisha died, even his grave became associated with a final sign of life. When men hurriedly placed a dead body into the prophet's tomb, the corpse touched Elisha's bones and revived. The prophet was gone. The word he carried had not lost its power. Under Jehoash, Israel won back cities from Aram. Then his son Jeroboam II came to the throne. Jeroboam II ruled longer than many northern kings. Militarily, his reign was successful. Israel recovered territory and restored borders that had been lost. Trade increased. The wealthy built impressive homes. Markets expanded. The kingdom looked strong again. After generations of instability, the prosperity appeared to offer proof that Israel had survived its darkest period. But the prophets saw something different. Amos came from Judah, from the small town of Tekoa. He was not introduced as a professional court prophet. He tended livestock and cared for sycamore trees. Yet he was sent north with a message Israel did not want to hear. Amos described wealthy citizens reclining on expensive furniture, feasting on rich food, drinking wine and enjoying music, while ignoring the ruin developing around them. The prosperity of the kingdom was not shared equally. The poor were being sold for debt. Judges accepted bribes. Merchants cheated with dishonest scales. The vulnerable were crushed, while religious festivals continued. Israel still brought sacrifices. Songs still rose from sanctuaries. But God rejected worship separated from justice. The people desired the day of the Lord, imagining it would bring victory over their enemies. Amos warned that for an unrepentant nation, that day would be darkness rather than light. Religious confidence could not transform judgment into blessing. Amos stood at Bethel, one of the centers created by Jeroboam I. Amaziah the priest of Bethel accused him of conspiracy and ordered him to return to Judah. This was the king's sanctuary, Amaziah said. It was the temple of the kingdom. The language revealed how worship had been claimed by political power. Bethel no longer functioned merely as a place where the people sought God. It served the stability of the state. Amos refused to retreat. He had not chosen the prophetic calling as a profession. God had taken him from his ordinary work and sent him to Israel. The message remained. The sanctuary would be judged. The dynasty would fall. The people would go into exile. Another prophet, Hosea, spoke during the final decades of the northern kingdom. His own family life became a painful sign of Israel's unfaithfulness. Hosea described the covenant as a marriage betrayed by persistent infidelity. Israel pursued Baal political alliances, wealth, and military strength, while forgetting the God who had brought the nation out of Egypt. Yet Hosea's message contained grief as well as judgment. God's anger was not presented as detached cruelty. It was the response of covenant love rejected again and again. "How can I give you up?" the message asked. Judgment was coming. Compassion had not disappeared. Israel's tragedy was that it continued interpreting temporary prosperity as permanent security. Jeroboam II died. The stability of his long reign vanished almost immediately. His son Zechariah ruled only 6 months before Shallum assassinated him. With Zechariah's death, the 4-generation dynasty promised to Jehu came to an end. Shallum ruled for 1 month. Menahem attacked him, killed him, and took the throne. The royal transitions had again become a chain of murder. Beyond Israel's borders, a far greater power was moving west. Assyria was not simply another neighboring kingdom like Moab or Aram. It was an empire built through disciplined armies, siege warfare, terror, tribute, and systematic deportation. Its kings did not merely defeat opponents. They broke resistance by removing populations, resettling conquered territories, and turning independent nations into dependent provinces. Tiglath-Pileser III expanded Assyrian power across the ancient Near East. When he came against Israel, Menahem preserved his throne by paying an enormous tribute. The money was collected from wealthy Israelites. The king remained in power, but Israel's independence had been reduced. A ruler who once governed his own kingdom now survived with the permission of an empire. Menahem's son, Pekahiah, ruled after him and was assassinated by Pekah, one of his officers. Pekah then joined Rezin, king of Aram, in a coalition against Assyria. They pressured Judah to join them. Ahaz, king of Judah, refused. Aram and Israel invaded Judah in order to remove Ahaz and replace him with a ruler who would support their alliance. The conflict became known as the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. Jerusalem trembled. Ahaz faced enemies from the north and believed the Davidic kingdom might be destroyed. The prophet Isaiah met him with a message of reassurance. The two invading kings were compared to smoldering pieces of wood. Their plans would not ultimately succeed. Ahaz was urged to stand firm in faith. He was even invited to ask for a sign. The king refused, using religious language to disguise unbelief. He had already chosen another solution. Ahaz appealed to Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria. He called himself the Assyrian king's servant and son, and sent silver and gold from the temple and royal treasuries. Judah invited the empire into its own crisis. Assyria attacked Damascus and killed Rezin. It also seized large portions of northern Israel, including Galilee and territories east of the Jordan. Many inhabitants were deported. Pekah was assassinated by Hosea. The northern kingdom had now been reduced to a smaller territory centered upon Samaria. Assyria had saved Ahaz from his immediate enemies, but the price was political submission and deeper compromise. When Ahaz visited Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, he saw an altar that impressed him. He sent its design to the priest Uriah in Jerusalem. A copy was built before the king returned. The bronze altar associated with temple worship was moved aside, and the new foreign-style altar took its place. Ahaz altered temple furnishings and closed or changed elements of worship under Assyrian pressure. The king, who had been offered a sign from God, chose instead to imitate the religious symbols of the empire he feared. Judah still possessed the temple, but its king was reshaping worship according to foreign power. In Israel, Hosea became the final king. He paid tribute to Assyria, but later sought help from Egypt and stopped sending the required payment. The rebellion was discovered. Hosea was imprisoned. The Assyrian army invaded and surrounded Samaria. For 3 years, the capital endured siege. The city Omri had built on a defensible hill had resisted enemies for generations. It had been the royal center of Ahab, Jehu, Jeroboam II, and every northern dynasty after Omri. Now no prophet announced rescue, no sudden panic emptied the enemy camp, no king led Israel into victory. Samaria fell. The people of Israel were deported to regions throughout the Assyrian Empire. Other populations were later brought into the land and settled among the remaining inhabitants. The northern kingdom ceased to exist as an independent nation.
This was not simply the defeat of one king. It was the end of a kingdom that had lasted for roughly 2 centuries. The books of Kings pause to explain why. Israel had feared other gods. The people had adopted practices of surrounding nations. They had built high places, pillars, and idols. They had ignored the prophets sent repeatedly to warn them. They had followed worthless things and become worthless in their worship. They had rejected the covenant-practiced divination and even sacrificed children. From Jeroboam's golden calves to Ahab's Baal worship, from royal violence to social injustice, the rebellion had accumulated across generations. Assyria was the historical conqueror, but the biblical account refused to interpret the fall as military accident alone. The exile was covenant judgment after prolonged warning. The northern tribes were removed from the land. Yet not every Israelite vanished, and not every member of the northern tribes was carried away. Some had previously moved south. Others remained among the population. Later biblical history continued to recognize people connected to Israel's tribes. The phrase "lost tribes" can therefore create an impression more absolute than the text supports. The northern kingdom was lost as a political state. Its people were scattered. Its identity was fractured. Its capital belonged to an empire. Judah watched all of this happen. The southern kingdom had survived the alliance of Aram and Israel. Jerusalem still stood. The temple remained. The house of David continued. It would have been easy for Judah to assume that survival proved permanent protection. Then Ahaz died. His son Hezekiah became king. Hezekiah rejected many of his father's practices. He removed high places, broke sacred pillars, cut down the Asherah, and destroyed the bronze serpent Moses had made in the wilderness because the people had begun burning incense to it. An object once connected with healing had become an idol. Hezekiah's reform showed that even a sacred symbol could become corrupt when separated from its original purpose. According to Chronicles, Hezekiah reopened and cleansed the temple. Priests and Levites restored worship. He invited people from both Judah and the surviving remnant of Israel to come to Jerusalem for Passover. Messengers traveled through the land calling the people to return. Some mocked them. Others humbled themselves and came. For a moment, worship in Jerusalem gathered people from both kingdoms after the northern state had fallen. Hezekiah trusted the Lord and rebelled against Assyrian domination. But Assyria was not weakened. A new king, Sennacherib, invaded Judah. He captured fortified cities one after another. The advance was devastating. Villages fell. Refugees fled toward Jerusalem. The kingdom beyond the capital was stripped away. Hezekiah attempted to purchase relief. He gave Assyria silver from the temple and royal treasury, and even stripped gold from the temple doors. The payment did not end the threat. Sennacherib sent a powerful delegation toward Jerusalem. The Assyrian field commander stood near the city's water supply, within hearing distance of officials and people upon the wall. His speech was designed to destroy confidence before the battle began. He mocked Judah's reliance on Egypt. He questioned Hezekiah's military strength. He claimed that removing high places had offended Judah's God. He argued that no god of any nation had been able to rescue its land from Assyria. Why should Jerusalem be different? The officials asked him to speak in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, so the people would not understand. He refused. He wanted everyone upon the wall to hear. He promised peace, food, vineyards, and eventual relocation if they surrendered. He warned them not to trust Hezekiah's claim that the Lord would deliver the city. The people remained silent because the king had commanded them not to answer. Hezekiah's officials returned with torn clothes. The king entered the temple and sent messengers to Isaiah. The prophet answered that Jerusalem should not be afraid of the blasphemous words it had heard.
the Assyrian king would receive a report withdraw and eventually fall in his own land. But the pressure continued. A letter arrived repeating the threat. Hezekiah took it into the temple and spread it before the Lord. His prayer did not deny Assyria's power. The empire had destroyed nations and burned their gods. But those gods were human-made objects of wood and stone. Hezekiah asked for deliverance so that the kingdoms of the earth would know that the Lord alone was God. Isaiah delivered the answer. Assyria had mocked the Holy One of Israel and boasted that its own power had conquered nations. But the empire had not created its own place in history. Its victories operated within limits it did not understand. Sennacherib would not enter Jerusalem. He would not shoot an arrow into the city or build a siege ramp against it. God would defend Jerusalem for his own sake and for the sake of David. That night, disaster struck the Assyrian camp. The biblical account states that the angel of the Lord killed a vast number of soldiers. By morning, the army surrounding Jerusalem had been shattered. Sennacherib withdrew to Nineveh. The city survived. Years later, while worshiping in the temple of his god, the Assyrian king was assassinated by his own sons. The empire that had destroyed Samaria failed to take Jerusalem. For the people inside the city, the deliverance must have seemed like proof that Zion could never fall. The temple still stood. The house of David remained. Isaiah's word had been fulfilled. The Assyrian army had departed without entering the city. But Hezekiah's story did not end with the victory. He became seriously ill. Isaiah told him to put his household in order because he would die. Hezekiah prayed and wept. His life was extended, and a sign confirmed the promise. Envoys later arrived from Babylon, a kingdom not yet dominant over Judah. Hezekiah welcomed them and displayed his treasuries, weapons, silver, gold, and everything of value. Isaiah asked what the visitors had seen. Hezekiah admitted that he had shown them everything. The prophet announced that a day would come when all those treasures would be carried to Babylon. Some of Hezekiah's descendants would also be taken away and serve in the Babylonian palace. The threat was no longer only Assyria. A future empire had entered the story. Hezekiah responded that the prophetic word was good reasoning that peace and security would remain during his own lifetime. His answer revealed a troubling limitation. The king who had prayed for the survival of Jerusalem appeared willing to accept future disaster as long as it did not arrive during his reign. Hezekiah accomplished much. He reformed worship, trusted God during invasion, strengthened Jerusalem's defenses, and constructed a tunnel to secure the city's water. But one faithful reign could not settle the future. His son would inherit the throne, and under Manasseh, Judah would descend into a depth of violence and idolatry that made the fall of Jerusalem no longer seem impossible. Israel had fallen. Judah had been spared. But survival was not the same as innocence, and the city rescued from Assyria would soon begin believing that rescue had made it untouchable. Judah had survived Assyria. Jerusalem remained standing. The temple still rose above the city. The house of David still possessed the throne. But survival had created a dangerous illusion. The people could look back upon the night Assyria withdrew and conclude that Jerusalem was untouchable. They could point to the temple and assume that no enemy would ever destroy the place where God had chosen to put his name. They could remember Hezekiah's faith while ignoring the warning Isaiah had given concerning Babylon. Then Manasseh became king. He was only 12 years old when he inherited the throne, and he ruled longer than any other king of Judah. A long reign might have provided stability. Instead, according to the books of Kings, Manasseh led Judah into one of the darkest periods in its history. He reversed the reforms of his father. The high places Hezekiah had removed were rebuilt.
Altars to Baal were restored. An Asherah image was made. Manasseh worshipped the host of heaven, the sun, moon, stars, and celestial powers, and built altars to them within the courts of the temple. The house dedicated to the worship of the Lord became crowded with rival loyalties. Manasseh practiced sorcery, sought omens, and consulted mediums. He sacrificed his son in fire. The practices for which the Canaanite nations had been judged were now being established under a king from David's line. The corruption was not limited to royal religion. Manasseh shed so much innocent blood that the biblical account describes Jerusalem as filled from one end to the other. The city, once known for David's administration of justice, became a place where power protected violence. The prophets warned Judah, because Manasseh had acted more wickedly than the nations before him and had led Judah into sin, Jerusalem would face disaster. The judgment was described with terrifying imagery. Jerusalem would be measured as Samaria had been measured. The house of David's capital would be wiped as someone wipes a dish, turning it upside down after it has been emptied. The comparison was deliberate. Judah had watched northern Israel fall. Now the same standard was being applied to Jerusalem. The temple did not make Judah immune. The Davidic dynasty did not give its kings permission to abandon the covenant. The chronicler preserves another dimension of Manasseh's story. He describes the king being taken captive by Assyrian commanders, humbled in distress, and later restored to Jerusalem. Manasseh then removed some foreign gods and attempted to repair the altar of the Lord. This repentance matters. It shows that even a king responsible for extraordinary evil was not beyond personal humility and mercy. But the reform came late. The people had been shaped by decades of corruption. Altars could be removed more quickly than habits. A king could humble himself without undoing every consequence his rule had created. The books of Kings therefore emphasize not only Manasseh's personal actions, but the lasting direction Judah had taken under him. His son Amon succeeded him. Amon returned to the idolatrous practices of his father's earlier years and did not humble himself. After only 2 years, his own servants assassinated him in the palace. The people of the land killed the conspirators and placed Amon's young son Josiah upon the throne. Josiah was 8 years old. Once again, the future of David's house rested upon a child. No one looking at the boy could know that he would become the final great reforming king of Judah. Josiah grew up within a kingdom carrying the damage of Manasseh's reign. The temple still stood, but its courts had been profaned. Pagan worship existed throughout the land. The Assyrian Empire remained powerful, though signs of weakness were beginning to appear. As Josiah matured, he began seeking the God of David. He ordered the temple repaired. Money collected from the people was given to workers, carpenters, builders, masons, and others, restoring the neglected house. During this work, Hilkiah, the high priest, found a book of the law in the temple. The text does not explain precisely how long it had been lost or hidden, but its discovery revealed how far Judah had drifted. The law, meant to guide the nation, had become unfamiliar even within the building dedicated to covenant worship. Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan, the royal secretary. Shaphan read it. Then he carried it to the king. After reporting on the repair work, he added that Hilkiah had found a book. He read it aloud before Josiah. The king listened. Then he tore his clothes. Josiah did not treat the words as an ancient artifact or a ceremonial possession. He understood them as a living standard exposing Judah's guilt. The covenant contained blessings for faithfulness and curses for rebellion. The history of the kingdom now appeared beneath that light. The idolatry, injustice, violence, and neglect of worship were not isolated mistakes. Judah had broken covenant. Josiah sent officials to seek the word of the Lord concerning what had been read. They went to Huldah the prophetess. She delivered a message with two parts. Disaster would come upon Jerusalem because the people had abandoned the Lord and worshipped other gods. The judgment described in the book would not simply disappear because the scroll had been rediscovered. But Josiah had humbled himself. He had torn his clothes and wept when he heard the words. Because of that response, he would not live to see the full destruction. The message was both merciful and sobering. Josiah's repentance mattered. His reform would matter. Yet one faithful king could not pretend that generations of rebellion had never happened. Josiah gathered the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went to the temple with priests, prophets, and the people from the least to the greatest. The words of the covenant book were read aloud. Standing beside a pillar, the king made a covenant before the Lord. He committed himself to follow God with all his heart and soul, and to obey the commands written in the book. The people joined him. Then the reform began. Objects connected to Baal, Asherah, and the host of heaven were removed from the temple and burned outside Jerusalem. Idolatrous priests were deposed. Houses connected with pagan rituals near the temple were torn down. Josiah defiled the high places throughout Judah so that they could no longer be used as before. He removed altars established by earlier kings. He destroyed the altar at Bethel, the center Jeroboam I had built centuries earlier when the kingdom first divided. The ancient prophecy, spoken by the unnamed man of God, was fulfilled. A descendant of David named Josiah stood at the place where northern Israel's institutional rebellion had begun. He burned human bones upon the altar and rendered it unclean. The northern kingdom was already gone. Samaria had fallen. Its kings had disappeared. Yet Josiah's actions showed that the sins of Jeroboam had not been forgotten. The reform reached beyond Judah into territories once associated with Israel. Josiah removed remaining shrines and priests in the former northern lands. For a moment, a king from David's house acted across portions of the territory once held by the United Kingdom. Josiah then commanded the nation to observe Passover. The celebration was carried out with extraordinary care. According to Kings, no Passover like it had been observed since the days of the judges. Chronicles describes priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, and large offerings prepared for the people. The festival remembered liberation from Egypt, but in Josiah's day, it also became a national return to a story Judah had nearly forgotten. Israel had once been delivered from slavery. Israel had received covenant. Israel belonged to God before it belonged to any king. Josiah removed mediums, household gods, idols, and other corruptions. The biblical account praises him with unusual language. No king before him had turned to the Lord with all his heart, soul, and strength, in accordance with the law of Moses. Nor did a king like him arise afterward. Yet the next sentence darkens the celebration. The Lord's anger against Judah did not turn away because of everything Manasseh had done. This does not mean Josiah's obedience was meaningless. It means reform is not the same as erasing history. The people could participate in Passover while some hearts remained unchanged. Idols could be broken while political arrogance survived. A righteous king could delay disaster without permanently transforming every generation that followed him. Beyond Judah, the political world was changing rapidly. Assyria, the empire that had destroyed Samaria and nearly captured Jerusalem, was weakening. Babylon rebelled under Nabopolassar. The Medes joined the struggle. Assyrian cities fell one after another. Nineveh, the great imperial capital, was destroyed. The empire that had once appeared unstoppable
was collapsing. Egypt moved north under Pharaoh Necho II, hoping to influence the balance of power and assist the remaining Assyrian forces against Babylon. Josiah went out to confront him at Megiddo. The biblical accounts provide only limited explanation for Josiah's political decision. Chronicles records that Necho warned him not to interfere, claiming that his campaign was directed elsewhere.
Josiah did not withdraw. He entered battle in disguise. Archers struck him. His servants carried him from the battlefield, and he died. The reforming king, who had been promised that he would not see Jerusalem's destruction, died suddenly in war. Judah mourned. Jeremiah composed laments for him. The people had lost not only a king, but the last ruler with the moral authority to hold the nation's reform together. Josiah's death became a turning point. The years that followed moved quickly. The people placed his son Jehoahaz on the throne. He ruled only 3 months. Pharaoh Necho removed him, imprisoned him, and imposed tribute upon Judah. Jehoahaz was taken to Egypt, where he died. Egypt then appointed another son of Josiah, Eliakim, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. The renaming demonstrated foreign control. Judah still had a king from David's line, but the throne was being managed by stronger powers. Jehoiakim taxed the land to pay Egypt's demands. He built for himself while the nation suffered. Jeremiah condemned him for constructing an impressive palace through injustice, withholding wages, and using royal position for personal luxury. The prophet contrasted Jehoiakim with Josiah. Josiah had defended the cause of the poor and needy. That Jeremiah said was part of what it meant to know God. Jehoiakim possessed the title of king. He did not possess his father's heart. Jeremiah had been called as a prophet during Josiah's reign. His ministry would continue through the final decades of Judah. He spoke during one of the most unstable periods in Jerusalem's history. Empires were changing. Kings were being installed and removed. Armies moved across the region. Court prophets promised security. Jeremiah repeatedly announced that the greatest danger was not simply the army outside Judah. It was the refusal to repent within it. He stood at the gate of the temple and confronted those entering to worship. The people repeated confident words, "The temple of the Lord." They treated the building as a guarantee. Jeremiah challenged that belief. Would they steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, worship other gods, and then stand in the temple claiming safety? He pointed them toward Shiloh, the earlier sanctuary associated with the Ark before the monarchy. Sacred history had not protected Shiloh when Israel rebelled. Jerusalem could face the same fate. The message was dangerous. Priests, prophets, and officials seized Jeremiah and demanded his death. He had spoken against the city and temple. Jeremiah defended himself. He had been sent to deliver the warning. If Judah changed its ways, disaster could be withheld. If they killed him, they would shed innocent blood. Some elders remembered the prophet Micah, who had announced judgment during Hezekiah's reign. Hezekiah had not executed him. He had humbled himself. Jeremiah was spared, but another prophet named Uriah delivered a similar message and fled to Egypt when threatened. Jehoiakim had him brought back and killed. The contrast between Josiah and Jehoiakim could not have been sharper. Josiah heard the law, tore his clothes, and sought guidance. Jehoiakim heard warnings and silenced those who delivered them. Babylon now replaced Assyria as the dominant imperial power. Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar, defeated Egyptian forces at Carchemish. The victory shifted control of the region. Judah moved from Egyptian domination to Babylonian control. Jehoiakim became Nebuchadnezzar's servant for several years. Then he rebelled. Jeremiah dictated prophetic messages to his scribe Baruch. The scroll contained warnings spoken over many years. Baruch read it publicly in the temple,
and officials later brought it before the king. Jehoiakim sat in his winter apartment with a fire burning. As the scroll was read, the king cut off sections with a knife and threw them into the flames. He did not tear his clothes. He did not seek the Lord. He destroyed the document piece by piece. The gesture symbolized the final attitude of Judah's royal leadership. The word exposing the king was treated as though it could be eliminated by burning the page. Jeremiah dictated the message again, adding further words. The king could burn a scroll. He could not burn away the judgment it announced. Jehoiakim died during the period of Babylonian pressure. The biblical accounts do not provide every detail of his death and burial in the same way, but his promised royal honor had collapsed. His son Jehoiachin, also called Jeconiah or Coniah, became king. He was young and ruled only 3 months in Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar's forces surrounded the city. Jehoiachin surrendered with his mother, officials, commanders, and palace servants. Babylon took treasures from the temple and royal palace. Skilled workers, soldiers, craftsmen, and members of the elite were deported. Among the captives taken during the Babylonian deportations were people who would shape the story of exile, including the prophet Ezekiel in one of the early removals. Jehoiachin was taken to Babylon. The king of Judah now lived as a captive in the empire's capital. Nebuchadnezzar placed Jehoiachin's uncle Mattaniah on the throne and renamed him Zedekiah. Again, a foreign ruler changed the name of a Davidic king. Zedekiah governed Jerusalem, but his kingship existed beneath Babylonian authority. He was not entirely without opportunities. Jeremiah continued speaking. The prophet urged submission to Babylon not because Babylon was righteous, but because judgment had reached a stage at which resistance would only increase destruction. Jeremiah even wore a yoke as a visible sign. Judah had been commanded to accept Babylonian rule for a time. False prophets rejected that message. Hananiah publicly broke the wooden yoke from Jeremiah's neck and promised that Babylon's power would be broken quickly. The message sounded hopeful. It was also false. Jeremiah answered that a wooden yoke would be replaced with an iron one. Hananiah died within the year, as Jeremiah had warned. The conflict was not between hope and despair. It was between hope rooted in truth and reassurance that denied reality. Jeremiah also sent a letter to those already exiled in Babylon. They were to build houses, plant gardens, marry, raise families, and seek the peace of the city where they had been taken. The exile would not end immediately, yet it would not last forever. After an appointed period, God would visit his people and bring them home. Jeremiah announced restoration even while warning Jerusalem of destruction. He spoke of a new covenant written upon the heart. He described a future in which God would forgive sin and restore his people. He also reaffirmed hope connected to David's line, but those promises did not mean Zedekiah could ignore the crisis before him. The king was weak, divided between fear of Babylon pressure from his officials and concern over how the people would respond. At times, he secretly sought Jeremiah's counsel. Yet he rarely possessed the courage to act upon it. Judah's final political leaders looked toward Egypt for rescue. The same pattern had returned. When Assyria threatened Ahaz, he sought Assyria rather than trusting God. When Babylon threatened Zedekiah, the court looked toward Egypt. Foreign alliances appeared more immediate than prophetic truth. Zedekiah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon returned. The army advanced through Judah, capturing fortified cities until only a few remained. Jeremiah described Lachish and Azekah as among the final strongholds still resisting. Jerusalem was surrounded. For a time, an Egyptian force moved north, and the Babylonians temporarily lifted the siege. Hope swept through the city. Perhaps Egypt would save them. Perhaps Jeremiah had been wrong. Perhaps Jerusalem would survive as it had under Hezekiah. Jeremiah warned that the relief was temporary.
Even if Judah somehow defeated the Babylonian army until only wounded men remained, those wounded soldiers would rise and burn the city. The outcome had been determined. Jeremiah attempted to leave Jerusalem to attend to property in Benjamin. He was accused of deserting to the Babylonians. Though he denied the charge, he was beaten and imprisoned. Zedekiah secretly called for him and asked whether there was a word from the Lord. There was. The king would be delivered into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. Jeremiah asked why he remained imprisoned when the prophets who had promised Babylon's withdrawal had been proven false. Zedekiah transferred him to a guarded courtyard and ordered that he receive bread as long as food remained in the city. Jeremiah continued speaking. Those who remained in Jerusalem would die by sword, famine, or plague. Those who surrendered to Babylon would live. Officials heard the message and accused him of weakening the soldiers. They demanded his death. Zedekiah gave him into their hands. They lowered Jeremiah into a cistern. There was no water, only mud, and the prophet sank into it. An official named Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian serving in the palace, went to the king and protested. Jeremiah would die of starvation. Zedekiah permitted a rescue. Ebed-Melech gathered worn cloths and ropes so that Jeremiah could be lifted without tearing his skin. The foreign servant acted with courage, while Judah's leaders tried to silence the prophet. Jeremiah remained in the courtyard. Zedekiah met him one final time in secret. The prophet told him plainly that surrender would preserve his life and spare the city from fire. Zedekiah confessed his fear. He was afraid of Judeans who had already defected to Babylon. He feared humiliation and abuse. Jeremiah urged him to obey. But Zedekiah did not surrender. Fear had governed Saul when he listened to the people instead of obeying God. Fear had governed Jeroboam when he built the calves. Fear had shaped alliances and altars and royal decisions for generations. Now fear held Judah's final king inside a doomed city. Nebuchadnezzar's army returned and closed around Jerusalem. The siege tightened. Food disappeared. Families searched for anything that could keep them alive. The streets, once filled with festival crowds, became places of hunger. The temple still stood above the city. The priests still possessed sacred traditions. The throne of David still had a man seated upon it. But none of these could reverse centuries of rebellion without repentance. Outside the walls, Babylon waited. Inside them, Zedekiah hesitated. Jeremiah's warning had become the city's final open door. Surrender, and some lives could be spared. Resist, and Jerusalem would burn. The last king of Judah made his choice. And the army of Babylon began breaking through the walls. The army of Babylon broke through the walls. After months of siege hunger, fear, and failed resistance, Jerusalem's defenses could no longer hold. Babylonian soldiers entered the city that David had captured centuries earlier and that Solomon had transformed into the center of Israel's kingdom. Judah's officials fled. The royal army collapsed. The city that had survived Assyria was now open before its enemy. Zedekiah, the last ruling king of Judah, escaped during the night with his soldiers. They passed through a gate near the royal garden and moved toward the Arabah, hoping to reach the Jordan Valley. For years Jeremiah had warned him, if Zedekiah surrendered, his life could be preserved and Jerusalem might be spared from complete destruction. But the king had feared his officials, his enemies, his own people, and the humiliation of submission. Now he fled the city. He had refused to surrender. Babylonian forces pursued him. They overtook him near the plains of Jericho. The army surrounding him scattered, and Zedekiah was captured. He was taken north to Riblah, where Nebuchadnezzar had established his military headquarters. There the king of Babylon pronounced judgment. Zedekiah's sons were killed before his eyes. The leaders of Judah were executed. Then Zedekiah was blinded. The final image he ever saw was the destruction of his own royal line.
He was bound in bronze chains and taken to Babylon. The last king to rule from Jerusalem did not die upon the throne. He entered exile as a blind prisoner. The dynasty of David still existed by blood, but its political rule in Jerusalem had ended. Back in the capital, the destruction continued. Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, entered Jerusalem on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar. He burned the temple, the royal palace, and the great houses of the city. The flames spread through buildings that had stood for generations. The temple Solomon had built was destroyed. Its bronze pillars were broken apart. The great basin and other furnishings were dismantled. Bronze, silver, and gold were carried away to Babylon. The city walls were torn down. Priests and officials were taken to Riblah and executed. More people were deported. Jerusalem was left burned, broken, and largely emptied. The fall was more than a military defeat. The central symbols of Judah's identity had collapsed together. The king was gone. The palace was gone. The walls were gone. The temple was gone. The people had once believed that these institutions guaranteed their security. Yet the prophets had repeatedly warned that covenant symbols could not protect a nation determined to reject the covenant itself. The temple had never been a charm against judgment. The throne had never placed David's descendants above obedience. Jerusalem had never been promised safety regardless of how its rulers and people lived. The exile did not begin when Babylon entered the city. It had begun in the choices repeated across generations. It began when kings treated power as personal possession. It grew when worship became a tool of political control. It deepened when injustice was defended by those responsible for judging it. It advanced when prophets were mocked, imprisoned, threatened, and killed. By the time the walls fell, the destruction visible outside Jerusalem reflected a collapse that had long been taking place within it. Still, Babylon did not remove everyone. Some of the poorest people were left in the land to work vineyards and fields. Nebuchadnezzar appointed Gedaliah, a member of a respected Judean family, to govern them from Mizpah. For the survivors, Gedaliah represented a fragile possibility. The kingdom was gone, but life in the land could continue. Judeans who had fled to surrounding nations began returning. Soldiers who had escaped the Babylonian conquest came to Gedaliah. He urged them not to fear serving Babylon. They could settle, gather crops, and rebuild a reduced community. It was not independence, but it was survival. Then another act of violence destroyed even that limited stability. Ishmael, a man of royal blood, came to Gedaliah with companions. Despite warnings about a possible conspiracy, Gedaliah trusted him. During a meal, Ishmael and his men killed Gedaliah. They also murdered Judeans and Babylonian soldiers who were with him. The assassination terrified the remaining population. They feared that Babylon would retaliate. Once again, leaders turned toward Egypt. Johanan and other commanders gathered the survivors and prepared to flee south. Before leaving, they asked Jeremiah to seek guidance from God. They promised to obey whatever answer came. Jeremiah told them not to go to Egypt. If they remained in Judah, God would preserve them. They should not fear the king of Babylon, but if they fled to Egypt to escape war and famine, the very disasters they feared would follow them there. The people rejected the message. They accused Jeremiah of lying and claimed that Baruch had influenced him against them. The remnant entered Egypt and forced Jeremiah to go with them. The history of Judah's monarchy had ended, but the pattern of refusing prophetic warning continued even among the survivors. They had requested guidance only if it confirmed the decision they had already made. Jeremiah had spent decades speaking to kings, priests, officials, soldiers, and ordinary people. He had warned of destruction while there was still time to repent. He had been beaten, imprisoned, placed in stocks, threatened with death, and lowered into a muddy cistern. He had been accused of treason because he told the truth about Babylon.
Now he stood among refugees outside the land, watching the consequences he had long tried to prevent. Jeremiah's message had not failed because Jerusalem fell. The fall confirmed it. Yet the prophet was not a man who celebrated being proven right. His words carried grief. The Book of Lamentations gives poetic expression to the devastation of Jerusalem. The once crowded city is pictured as sitting alone. Roads mourn because no one comes to the festivals. Priests groan, children suffer. The splendor of Zion disappears. The poetry does not soften the horror. It asks how such destruction could happen to the city once called great among the nations. It remembers hunger, death, humiliation, and the loss of everything that seemed permanent. But in the center of the grief, hope appears. God's covenant mercies have not been exhausted. Compassion is renewed. Faithfulness remains even when human faithfulness has collapsed. This hope does not deny judgment. It survives inside it. The prophets understood that exile was both an ending and a beginning. For northern Israel, Assyria had destroyed the kingdom and scattered the people. For Judah, Babylon had removed the king, destroyed the temple, and deported much of the population. The entire age of Israelite monarchy appeared to have ended in failure. Saul had begun with promise and ended in fear. David had united the tribes and received a lasting promise, yet his sin brought violence into his household. Solomon had built the temple and become famous for wisdom, yet his divided heart prepared the way for a divided kingdom. Jeroboam had received authority, but constructed false worship to protect it. Ahab and Jezebel had joined royal power to idolatry and injustice. Jehu had destroyed Ahab's house, but preserved the system that supported his own throne. Jeroboam II had governed during prosperity, while the poor were crushed. Ahaz had trusted Assyria. Hezekiah had trusted God during invasion, but exposed his treasures to Babylon. Manasseh had filled Jerusalem with idolatry and innocent blood. Josiah had turned faithfully to the covenant, but his reforms could not permanently transform the generations around him. The final kings had burned prophetic scrolls, broken treaties, trusted Egypt, and rejected the last opportunities for surrender. Israel's greatest problem had never been the absence of leadership alone. It was the inability of human kings to remain faithful. A strong king could defeat enemies and still be defeated by pride. A wise king could judge others and fail to guard his own heart. A reforming king could remove idols without changing every person beneath his rule. A royal dynasty could survive assassination and war while becoming spiritually empty. The monarchy revealed both the value and the limitation of human kingship. Israel needed justice, protection, unity, and faithful leadership, but no king consistently provided all of them. This failure gave greater meaning to the prophetic hope that emerged before and during exile. Isaiah had spoken of a child connected to David's throne, whose government would be marked by justice and peace. He described a shoot rising from the cut-down stump of Jesse. The image assumed that David's royal tree would appear felled, yet life would still come from the stump. Jeremiah spoke of a righteous branch from David who would rule wisely and establish justice. Ezekiel spoke of a future shepherd from the line and pattern of David who would care for the scattered flock. These promises did not claim that Jerusalem's final kings would suddenly recover the kingdom. They looked beyond the ruined monarchy toward a future act of restoration. Ezekiel delivered his message among the exiles in Babylon. Before Jerusalem's destruction, some captives believed the city would remain secure and that they would soon return home. Ezekiel warned that judgment was coming. He described the corruption of Jerusalem, the unfaithfulness of its leaders, and the departure of divine glory from the temple. When a survivor finally arrived with the news that the city had fallen, the prophet's role shifted more fully toward restoration. The people had lost land, temple, king, and national confidence. They compared themselves to dry bones scattered across a valley. There was no visible life. No human strength could rebuild what had been destroyed. In Ezekiel's vision, God asked whether those bones could live. The prophet answered that God alone knew. The bones came together. Sinews and flesh appeared. Breath entered them. The dead stood as a great multitude. The vision was given to a people who said their hope had been cut off. It promised that exile was not the final definition of Israel. Ezekiel also spoke of a new heart and a new spirit. The deepest restoration would require more than rebuilding walls or restoring a throne. The problem that had destroyed the kingdoms was rooted within the people. External institutions had not been enough. They needed inward transformation. The prophetic future, therefore, contained several connected hopes. The scattered people would be gathered. The land would be restored. The covenant relationship would be renewed. A faithful shepherd would lead them. The presence of God would return. These promises extended beyond what any single post-exilic generation would immediately experience, but they ensured that Babylon would not write the final chapter. Even before the return began, a small event inside Babylon signaled that the story of David's house was not over. Jehoiachin had been taken captive years before Jerusalem's final destruction. He had ruled Judah for only a few months before surrendering to Nebuchadnezzar. For decades he remained imprisoned. Then a new Babylonian king, Evil-Merodach, came to power. He released Jehoiachin from prison. The former king was treated kindly. He received a place of honor above other captive kings in Babylon. He exchanged his prison garments for new clothing and regularly ate at the royal table. Jehoiachin did not return to Jerusalem. He did not rebuild the temple. He did not reclaim David's throne. Judah remained in exile. Yet the books of Kings end not with Zedekiah blinded, not with the temple burning, and not with Gedaliah murdered. They end with a descendant of David lifted from prison. The scene is quiet compared with the victories of David or the glory of Solomon. There are no armies. No coronation trumpet sounds. No crowd cries out in Jerusalem. There is only a captive king receiving mercy in a foreign court. But the final image matters. Babylon had destroyed the kingdom. It had not erased the line. The throne stood empty, but the promise had not died. The story of Israel and Judah's kings therefore ends with both warning and hope. It warns that political power cannot replace faithfulness. It warns that religious institutions cannot protect injustice forever. It warns that prosperity may conceal decay and survival may create false confidence. It warns that ignored truth does not become false merely because judgment is delayed. But the story also shows patience. Prophets were sent again and again. Kings received opportunities to humble themselves. Judgment was delayed across generations. Mercy appeared even in kingdoms deeply compromised. The exile came only after warning had become one of the longest and most consistent patterns in the history of the nation. And even when judgment arrived, covenant purpose continued. The people were scattered but not forgotten. The city was destroyed, but restoration was promised. The dynasty lost its throne, but its line survived. Centuries later, the New Testament would open by tracing the ancestry of Jesus through Abraham, David, the kings of Judah, the exile, and the generations that followed. The exile was not removed from the family record. It became part of the road through which the messianic hope continued. The kings of Israel and Judah had risen and fallen. Some ruled with courage. Some ruled through fear. Some defended justice. Some murdered the innocent. Some humbled themselves. Others hardened their hearts until armies stood at their gates.
Together, their history demonstrated that no human throne could carry the full weight of Israel's hope. The kingdom needed more than another ruler who might begin well and end in compromise. It needed a king whose justice would not be corrupted, whose wisdom would not become pride, and whose faithfulness would not fail beneath the pressures of power. That expectation outlived Samaria. It outlived Jerusalem's walls. It outlived Solomon's temple. It outlived the exile itself. The monarchy ended, the promise moved forward. If this complete journey helped you understand how Israel's kings rose, divided, and fell, tell us in the comments which king or prophetic era should receive the next full documentary. Subscribe and continue with the next chapter, as the exiles enter Babylon and discover whether faith, identity, and the promise can survive without a king, a temple, or a homeland. Israel's kings disappeared. Judah's throne fell silent. But the throne stood empty, and the promise had not died.